Good morning, everyone. With a slight delay, I do apologize. But as I understand, the political groups are still in meeting, addressing some issues, I suppose. It means that the attendance at this stage is a little bit low as far as the people in the room are concerned. So sorry about that for the rapporteurs and specifically for the first one, Simon. But okay, you know how parliaments go. Huh? This is not unusual. It's a bit sad, but still, I'm just going to ring once more to have the colleagues. I see that we now have our 4 chairs of the committees, which is exactly what I waited for to start. So, dear colleagues, the seating is open. We have this morning a joint debate in the context of a very important environmental day. As you know, we have 7 reports today on our agenda. And we also have an event on the issue with high-level people addressing the Assembly at 3 o'clock. I hope that as many of our colleagues potentially will be able to be with us at 3 o'clock, because it is important. We've got Mr. Guterres, we've got the President of Hungary, the Speaker of the Italian Parliament, the Minister of Environment of Portugal, a judge of the court specialized in human rights. We've got the young activists, and I also have a little surprise, but it won't be a surprise if I'll tell you now, in that event. It is important because if the way I see the committees have taken this work, and I want to commend each and every one, the secretaries, the chairs, and specifically the rapporteurs, if we would be able to pass these reports and recommendations, it will be really a very important day for the Assembly, but also for all of the citizens in our 47 member states. Let's now head into the joint debate on 4 reports of the 7 on the theme of environment and climate change. The first is titled Anchoring the Right for a Healthy Environment, Need for Enhanced Action by the Council of Europe, for which the rapporteur is Monsieur Simon Moutquin from the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development. The second report is titled More Participatory, Democracy to Tackle Climate Change, for which the rapporteur is Mr. George Papandreou from the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy. The third report is titled Addressing Issues of Criminal and Civil Liability for Climate Change, for which the rapporteur is Mr. Zia Al-Tunyaldis from the Committee on Legal Affairs. And the fourth report is titled The Climate Crisis and the Rule of Law, for which the rapporteur is Madame Edith Estrella from the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development. This fourth report has an opinion from the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, which will be presented by Mr. Silevic. So, in order to finish at 1 o'clock, the then chair will interrupt the list of speakers at about 12:20 to allow time for the reply and the vote. The rapporteurs have 10 minutes in total, of which 7 minutes for your opening remarks and 3 minutes for your reply. The rapporteur for opinion will have 3 minutes. So to be clear, 7 minutes to start, 3 minutes to reply, and the rapporteur for opinion, Mr. Silevic, will have 3 minutes. Now let's start with the first report. Et donc je demande le collègue M. Simon Moutquin à présenter le premier rapport du Comité des affaires sociales, de la santé et du développement durable. Simon, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, chers collègues, cet été, à quelques kilomètres de chez moi, à Cours-Saint-Étienne, le village où j'étudiais quand j'étais lycéen, la rivière est montée et a détruit des centaines d'habitations. Cet été, à quelques kilomètres, à Erftstadt, Trau, Pepinster, Theux, dans la région liégeoise et celle de Rhénanie-Nord-Westphalie, 220 personnes ont été tuées et des dizaines de milliers d'autres sinistrées dans les pires inondations que nos régions aient connues. À quelques centaines de kilomètres, c'est en Espagne, en Grèce ou encore en Turquie que des milliers d'hectares de forêts sont partis en fumée, mettant la vie des habitants en danger et les obligeant à évacuer. À quelques milliers de kilomètres, c'est en Sibérie, une surface comparable à la moitié de l'Allemagne qui est partie en fumée, pendant que de l'autre côté du globe, les Canadiens enduraient des températures frôlant les 50 degrés. Chers collègues, vous le savez, ces événements ne sont que le début de bouleversements environnementaux qui nous attendent. Ils confirment en fait les prévisions faites par les scientifiques depuis près de 50 ans. Cet été encore, le dernier rapport du GIEC assurait une nouvelle fois l'impact indiscutable des activités sur le climat, nous annonçant que le réchauffement de 1,5 degré, prévu initialement pour 2040, était à craindre pour 2030. Par ailleurs, les rapports sur notre biodiversité nous montrent que nous sommes à la veille d'une 6e extinction de masse, et en effet, près d'un tiers des espèces connues sont aujourd'hui menacées d'expulsion. S'il fallait encore un chiffre, en Europe, la pollution atmosphérique est responsable de plus de 700 000 décès par an, alors qu'à l'échelle du globe, ce sont près d'un quart des décès qui sont imputables au dérèglement climatique. Alors face à ces constats que je pourrais en réalité multiplier encore et encore, il devient évident que l'ensemble de nos droits fondamentaux est aujourd'hui menacé par les crises écologiques et qu'il est urgent de reconnaître le droit à un environnement sain comme un droit à part entière. Il y a 50 ans, la déclaration de Stockholm établissait déjà l'interdépendance entre protection de l'environnement et droits humains. Depuis, de nombreux pays et régions du monde reconnaissent ce droit à un environnement autonome, notamment la Charte africaine, mais aussi la Cour interaméricaine des droits de l'homme, pas le Conseil de l'Europe. Et pourtant, en 1953, au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, notre Assemblée a apporté une réponse pour protéger les droits fondamentaux à travers la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme. Quelques années plus tard, c'est la Charte sociale qui donnait à nos citoyens des droits sociaux et économiques. Chers collègues, je pense que le Conseil de l'Europe a toujours été une lumière pour les droits fondamentaux dans le monde. Nous ne pouvons pas aujourd'hui laisser cette lumière s'affaiblir face à l'un des plus grands défis de ce monde, de ce siècle, celui de vivre dans un environnement sûr, propre, sain et durable. Tour à tour, les présidences géorgiennes, allemandes, grecques du Comité des ministres ont fait de la question environnementale une priorité absolue. La présidence actuelle de notre Assemblée aussi a placé l'ancrage de ce droit dans son agenda. J'en viens maintenant aux propositions du rapport qui affirme qu'aujourd'hui, nous devons ancrer le droit à l'environnement sain dans nos instruments juridiques. Le rapport qui vous est présenté est en réalité une sorte de panel de solutions permettant de répondre à cet enjeu du réchauffement climatique et du dérèglement climatique. Ce rapport et de nombreux autres qui suivent aujourd'hui sont une sorte d'encyclopédie que nous offririons au Comité des ministres. Le premier outil est la possibilité d'élaborer un protocole additionnel à la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme. Ce protocole permettrait d'une part d'inclure enfin dans notre ordre juridique un outil contraignant au sein des États directement utilisable par les citoyens pour prévenir et obtenir des réparations contre les atteintes à l'environnement. D'autre part, d'élaborer une approche préventive basée sur l'élimination des problèmes avant même qu'ils ne se présentent. Pour finir, il permettrait de donner un cadre clair aux juges de la Cour pour garantir des droits environnementaux autonomes et plus uniquement fondés sur l'interprétation d'autres articles de la Convention. C'est ce qu'on appelle le droit par ricochet. Par ailleurs, certains éléments repris dans le rapport reprennent des concepts juridiques forts et souhaitables dans ce protocole. Le principe de responsabilité, d'équité, de solidarité transgénérationnelle, le principe de prévention, de précaution et de non-régression, et pour finir, la protection de la nature en cas de doute. Un second mécanisme proposé est celui d'un protocole additionnel, cette fois-ci à la Charte sociale européenne. Contrairement aux droits civiques et politiques, qui sont des droits individuels par nature, les atteintes à l'environnement comportent pour la plupart une dimension collective. En étendant l'application de la Charte à la protection du droit à l'environnement sain, il sera possible pour des organisations de porter des réclamations en matière environnementale, ce qui serait un véritable progrès. Par exemple, imaginons qu'un territoire soit pollué, tous ses habitants en subissent les conséquences. Il apparaît donc logique et souhaitable que les réclamations puissent être faites de manière collective. Un autre outil proposé dans cet instrument est celui d'une convention 5P. De manière complémentaire à la mise en œuvre des protocoles, l'option de cette convention fait également partie des avancées souhaitées. En effet, certains juristes estiment que ces droits verts ne suivent pas la même logique que les droits civils et politiques, ni ceux d'ailleurs des droits sociaux. Ils préconisent un instrument spécifique. Une telle convention doit avoir pour objectif d'installer une vision non pas anthropocentrée mais écocentrée de la défense de l'environnement. Les principes de prévention et de précaution sont au cœur d'une telle convention et ils permettraient d'opérer ce changement de paradigme. Pour finir, le rapport rappelle également que les entreprises ont un rôle important à jouer dans la protection de l'environnement. Les entreprises, qu'on le veuille ou non, sont des acteurs fondamentaux de nos sociétés et c'est pourquoi il est crucial que leur responsabilité en matière d'environnement soit renforcée. Alors aujourd'hui, chers collègues, nous savons quelle est notre responsabilité face à ce dérèglement climatique et aux bouleversements environnementaux. Le déni n'est plus une option politique. Les Nations Unies aussi ont décidé de placer ce droit à l'environnement sain au sommet de leur agenda. Madame Bachelet, haute commissaire aux droits de l'homme, l'a rappelé lors de l'ouverture de la 48e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Aujourd'hui, le Conseil de l'Europe doit avoir l'ambition de jouer un rôle majeur dans la préservation des droits environnementaux face aux dérèglements environnementaux. Notre rôle en tant qu'institution ayant pour objectif de protéger 833 millions de personnes, c'est aujourd'hui d'ancrer l'environnement sain dans nos instruments juridiques. Chers collègues, pour les victimes de ces catastrophes climatiques de cet été et les autres, pour les jeunes et moins jeunes qui ont marché dans nos rues durant des mois afin de réclamer une justice climatique, pour maintenir cette biodiversité et ces écosystèmes qui s'éteignent, pour continuer à faire de l'Europe une lumière pour les droits fondamentaux, finalement pour celles ici, d'ici d'ailleurs, d'aujourd'hui et de demain, nous devons passer à l'action. Je vous remercie.
Merci Simon pour votre rapport. I now call on Mr. George Papandreou to present the second report from the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy. George, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, in 2016, 99 citizens of Ireland were chosen randomly by lottery. They were given the power to call on experts, government officials, business persons, civil society, NGOs, and youth organizations. Their task? To come up with recommendations on how to make Ireland a leader in tackling the climate crisis. After extensive democratic deliberation, almost 2,000 proposals from interested groups, they came up with 13 specific recommendations. Their work produced innovative ideas around public engagement and profoundly enriched environmental literacy in Ireland. The final report concluded that the state must take a lead role on mitigation, prioritize public transport spending over new roads, tax greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and stop subsidizing peat extraction. Strikingly, 80% of participants said they would be willing to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive activities. Importantly, the recommendations agreed on were more radical than many politicians expected. This Irish experiment is only one of many fascinating innovations in participatory and deliberative democracy. Numerous similar experiments are taking place around Europe, the EU and the Conference for the Future of Europe, the UN for COP26, and globally. And I strongly support, Mr. Chairman, the proposal that the Council of Europe and the EU develop a more permanent citizens' assembly for climate and the future of Europe. Participative democracy takes its inspiration from ancient Athens and Renaissance Italy. My report documents and evaluates many of these experiments, as well as much of the recent research on what is called the wisdom of the collective. Why is this important? With the Paris Agreement, we are asking our societies to undergo long-term adaptation or otherwise face devastating fires, floods, heat waves, extreme weather, new pandemics, and huge migratory flows, huge catastrophes. We must change our means of production, the way we eat and consume, how we build, how we travel, rethink our education, health, water, and energy systems. Dear colleagues, the transition towards a sustainable society must be socially just, climate justice, fighting the deep inequalities in our society, as discussed yesterday in our colleague Celine's report. It must also be an informed transition where educated citizenship will play a crucial role. And we, as humanity, do have the financial resources and also have the science to deal with the climate crisis. But no invisible hand will make this transition. It can only be done through the democratic will of our polity. That is why it also must be a democratic transition, one developed and owned by our citizens. Jürgen Habermas, a great thinker of our times, has said we must rethink the public sphere. Good governance also means the inclusion of citizens in the decision-making process. With the COVID pandemic, a top-down approach seemed to work at the initial stage. Yet as the pandemic continues, we now see the adaptive behavior needs the participation of all. And climate catastrophe is not a one-off crisis. It demands long-term adaptation of our societies. We can only do so effectively if we give agency to citizens for their participation, mobilization, their contribution, innovation, their wisdom and consensus. Indeed, I believe that in dealing with these crises, either we deepen our democratic practices and guarantee a peaceful transition, or we will face conflict, polarization, violence, and authoritarianism. My report concludes that participatory democracy when organized well, can contribute to this peaceful transition by developing a sense of dignity, pride, self-worth, and empowerment as citizens become part of the lawmaking process, contributing to transparency, greater trust, a legitimacy in politics, building understanding, shared responsibility, and ownership of decisions and policies. It can mirror society, giving voice to all groups, strata, stakeholders, certainly youth, minorities, providing for decisions and more social cohesion. Active citizenship and organized debate can address contentious issues beyond partisanship and polarization, hate speech, or fake news. Building a national debate, it reclaims the public space from the domination of digital giants that have created a false sense of empowerment, particularly for our younger generation, and that creates frustration. It also builds a healthy relationship between citizens and scientists or experts, which we have seen as critical during this pandemic. Finally, a striking conclusion from our hearings is that collective decision-making, collective wisdom, most often comes up with better results, better policy decisions than a highly qualified expert would alone. So when we say in people we trust, we can trust that the wisdom of the collective can better guide our decision-making process. However, deliberative and participative practices documented in my report will only be effective if they visibly influence power and the power structures. Good politics, yes, is innovative, imaginative politics, but democracy and participative democracy is not simply a technique. It must be guided by a philosophy, a culture, and a value system. The values of democratic rule, human rights, and the rule of law. I propose that we help our member states to be able to use these techniques, but also this philosophy in bringing more agency to our citizens in dealing with climate change, which I believe is the only way that we will be able to deal with this great crisis. Thank you very much.
We now move to Mr. Zia Al-Tunyaldis. I call on you, dear colleague, to present the third report from the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. You have 7 minutes.
Dear President, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to take part in this unprecedented all-day debate on issues related to the environment and human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. Given a growing climate emergency, I can only commend the Assembly's President's initiative to give priority to this topic and to organize this debate a month ahead of the Glasgow COP26. As Rapporteur of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, I have focused on issues related to states' criminal and civil liability in the context of climate change. Let me first stress the recognition of states' legal responsibility for climate change at national, European, and international levels began with the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. While human rights law may prove useful in this field, other areas of law, including civil law, criminal law, and constitutional law, have played an increasingly important role in climate litigation. For example, in the Dutch Urgenda case, national courts ordered the state to fulfill its duty of care and to reduce greenhouse gas emission in order to protect citizens' right to life and right to respect for private and family life. Last May, the German Federal Constitutional Court delivered a judgment comparable to the Urgenda one, but more far-reaching. Individuals and NGOs have also invoked climate change liability in cases against companies in other European countries. For example, last May in the Netherlands, a lower court of The Hague ordered Shell to reduce their carbon emission by 45%. Nevertheless, while climate change lawsuits have become more commonplace in the 21st century, an important legal argument is used against these developments. Climate change is damaging to all, but no one in particular. This means that the victims and those responsible must be named, which gives an incentive to further invoke the provisions of criminal and civil liability. Therefore, Due to the global nature of climate change, the topic of liability must also be addressed at European level. So far, 2 Council of Europe conventions aimed at reinforcing the responsibility for damage to the environment have been adopted. The 1998 Convention on the Protection of the Environment through Criminal Law and the 1993 Convention on Civil Liability for damage resulting from activities dangerous to the environment. The Convention on the Protection of the Environment through Criminal Law was the first binding international convention dedicated to harmonizing criminal law and environmental issues, including the issue of environmental offenses. It sought to develop a framework for sanctioning environmental criminality at European and national level, which is important considering that environmental pollution does not stop at national borders. Unfortunately, it has never entered into force as it had received only 1 ratification. This might be due to the fact that the existence of standalone criminal offenses, which are defined in the Convention and are completely separate from administrative law, was problematic in domestic legal system. Moreover, the adoption of the EU member states of Directive 2008/99/EC on the protection of the environment through criminal law might have overshadowed the Convention at that specific time. As regards the Convention on Civil Liability for damage resulting from activities dangerous to the environment, it aims at providing for adequate compensation for damage resulting from activities which are dangerous to the environment. One of the core features of the Convention is the polluter pays principle. Unfortunately, the Convention has not been ratified by any Council member state yet, my dear colleagues. In my report, I have reflected on how these treaties can be given renewed attention by Council of Europe member states. As regards the Convention on the Protection of the Environment through criminal law, it should be replaced as soon as possible by a legal instrument better adapted to the current challenges and better defining environmental offenses and sanctions. In this context, I welcome the establishment by the European Committee on Climate Problems of its working group on the environment and criminal law in November 2020. The working group has already held 2 meetings and has recently decided to prepare a feasibility study in order to assess whether the Convention on the Protection of the Environment through criminal law shall be replaced by a new legal instrument. As regards criminal liability, states could also consider introducing the crime of ecocide in their national criminal legislation, as well as recognizing universal jurisdiction for ecocide as well. Concerning civil liability, member states of the Council of Europe should ratify the Convention on Civil Liability for damage resulting from activities dangerous to the environment and take necessary measures to adapt it to the current challenges, in particular through amending its Appendix 1 and dangerous substances. They could also strengthen civil liability for environmental damage by amending national civil law legislation, in particular by adding specific provisions on responsibility for ecological harm or by expanding the scope of strict liability in some specific situations. To conclude, my dear colleagues, as many consequences of climate change are irreversible, one needs to focus on deterrence and corrective justice in order to adopt instruments that prevent, correct, and compensate for the damage caused by climate change. Therefore, relevant recommendations are included in draft resolution and draft recommendation proposed in my report. In the draft resolution, I call on Council of Europe member states to reinforce criminal and civil liability for acts and omissions that might have an impact on climate change, in particular by ensuring access to preventative and compensatory remedies. I also call on states to allow NGOs to launch climate litigation proceedings against state private entities and to ensure effective access to appropriate information and environmental matters to the public, and to strengthen corporate liability by requiring companies to detail their activities affecting to the environment. As regards the draft recommendation, I propose that the Assembly invite the Committee of Ministers to reflect on whether there is a need to revise or replace the two Council of Europe conventions on environment protection. The Committee of Ministers could also prepare a study on the notion of the ecocide and another one on national climate litigation. I hope that the Assembly will support the proposals, and I thank you for your good attention.
Thank you very much. We will maybe subtract a couple of seconds on your reply because you went over time. I now call upon Madam Estrela, Rapporteur for the fourth report. You have the floor, 7 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues, je tiens tout d'abord aujourd'hui. Cette journée historique marque le retour de l'environnement au cœur du mandat du Conseil de l'Europe. C'est une excellente nouvelle pour notre organisation. Aujourd'hui, nous affirmons avec force la crise climatique est au cœur de nos préoccupations. Les jeunes qui manifestent inlassablement pour le climat nous l'ont demandé. Nous avons entendu leur colère. Nous connaissons leur frustration à l'égard de la démocratie représentative et partageons leur inquiétude. Effectivement, nous avons pris beaucoup trop de temps. Il nous reste 8 ans d'après le GIEC pour tout changer. Le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, António Guterres, le disait encore la semaine dernière devant l'Assemblée générale. Nous sommes au bord du précipice et nous continuons de nous en approcher. Nous voyons les signes d'avertissement sur chaque continent et dans chaque région. Températures caniculaires, perte de biodiversité épouvantable, pollution de l'air, de l'eau et des espaces naturels. Et à chaque instant, des catastrophes liées au climat. Rendons-nous à l'évidence. Nous sommes moralement coupables de l'état du monde dans lequel nous vivons. Ces mots durs, mais réalistes, ne méritaient pas moins d'une première journée complète de débat dans cette Assemblée. Nos engagements contre la surchauffe planétaire sont gravés dans le marbre avec l'accord de Paris et les objectifs de développement durable. Nos pays ont rejoint le consensus mondial. Nous ne pouvons plus lancer des promesses et des paroles en l'air. Le moment est grave. Certes, il n'est pas trop tard, à condition d'assumer l'urgence. Nos pays ne pourront pas demeurer dans l'ambiguïté. Il n'est plus possible de se limiter à l'interdiction des gobelets en plastique, tout en continuant de polluer comme si rien n'avait changé. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est plus suffisant. Nous avons une occasion de repenser nos sociétés et nous devons saisir cette chance. Ne nous accrochons pas non plus aux fausses promesses technologiques, car elles pourraient ne pas être à la hauteur des espérances. Il est temps de nous adapter et de renforcer la résilience de nos sociétés. Nous devons tendre vers l'objectif préféré de 1,5 degré pour limiter l'augmentation de température. Nous devons aussi adopter l'objectif du zéro net émission. Ces décisions impliqueront des efforts que nous connaissons. Après plus de 20 ans de négociations internationales et d'alerte des scientifiques, nous ressentons la menace devant nous. Nous devons éviter la surchauffe qui peut rendre notre planète invivable à l'horizon de 2100. La décennie qui s'est ouverte en 2020 sera cruciale. Chers collègues, en tant que parlementaires, nous avons la responsabilité de relever le défi de la crise climatique. L'éventualité d'un scénario noir reste possible. Nous devons nous assurer que les institutions fonctionnent, qu'elles s'appuient sur les droits humains, la démocratie et la règle de droit. Nous devons travailler ensemble et faire pression sur les gouvernements pour faire respecter les engagements internationaux de nos pays. Aujourd'hui, chers collègues, vous allez vous prononcer sur mon rapport Crise climatique et l'état de droit. Celui-ci a, dans un premier temps, été voulu comme l'occasion d'interroger l'ensemble des outils dont dispose le Conseil de l'Europe pour rétablir la résilience climatique. Certains ont été efficaces, d'autres moins. Ce qui est sûr, c'est que sur le climat, notre organisation a été à l'avant-garde. Le Conseil de l'Europe n'a peut-être pas toujours profité des moyens à l'auteur de ses ambitions dans le domaine, faute de volonté politique. J'ai aussi cherché à explorer de nouvelles solutions créatives portées par des personnalités fortes et captivantes qui ont choisi d'être des acteurs du changement au cœur de la société civile. Nous devons voir dans la crise climatique une chance pour notre organisation et nos pays de s'adapter et d'accompagner le changement de mentalité. C'est le sens de l'action du Conseil de l'Europe depuis plus de 70 ans. C'est le Conseil qui a rendu impossible la peine de mort et interrogé de nombreux comportements jusqu'à ce qu'ils deviennent inacceptables pour toutes nos communautés. La ressource que ne devra pas manquer, ce sera la volonté politique. À nous, parlementaires, de veiller à ce qu'elle circule dans toute la société, dans nos communautés, dans toute l'administration, dans tous les secteurs. Chers collègues, changer les mentalités et préparer la résilience climatique sera difficile et fastidieux. En m'inspirant des succès remportés par notre Assemblée, j'ai souhaité que ce rapport propose la constitution d'un réseau autour d'un groupe de collègues motivés et engagés. Nous savons qu'il n'y aura pas de réponse simple aux défis devant nous. Nous devons explorer ensemble toutes les solutions à notre portée. Pour cela, nous devons échanger, expérimenter et agir en commun. Nous le devons pour éviter les conflits entre générations. Dans cette période d'instabilité, le Conseil de l'Europe demeure une vigie. Il devra apporter sa pierre pour garantir que les faibles ne seront pas les premières victimes des effets de la crise climatique et des conséquences des changements entrepris. Plus que jamais, il doit, aux côtés des États membres, appuyer les capacités de nos institutions nationales à résister aux menaces et anticiper une société profondément transformée. Le rôle des parlementaires sera essentiel. Encore une fois, je remercie Simon, Georges, Zia, mais aussi Rick, pour leur engagement qui a permis de remettre l'environnement au cœur de nos travaux. Ensemble, nous avons décidé d'accorder l'importance que mérite la menace climatique pour notre intérêt et celui de nos enfants. Je vous remercie pour votre attention. Merci beaucoup.
I now call upon our good friend Boris Ilevich, Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs, to present the opinion of his committee.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, the report of the Committee on Social Affairs just presented by Madame Estrella rightly focuses on the threats to the rule of law related to climate crisis and the latest developments concerning tackling this phenomenon at European level. It focuses on Council of Europe's existing instruments, which might prove useful in promoting climate resilience while ensuring respect for the rule of law, democracy and human rights. Moreover, its idea to establish under its auspices a parliamentary network should be welcomed. In the meantime, the Legal Affairs Committee has proposed some amendments to further strengthen the draft resolution and draft recommendation. In particular, it is necessary to stress the role of the European Court of Human Rights case law on states' positive obligation in environmental cases. This case law is already quite substantial and is growing fast. Moreover, we propose to add more detailed references to the notion of the rule of law, on which the Assembly has reflected in detail in its Resolution 1594 of 2007 on the principle of the rule of law, and in Resolution 2187 of 2017 on the Venice Commission's rule of law checklist. Although there is no clearly established and widely accepted definition of this concept, the Venice Commission has agreed that it should be defined by its ingredients, which are listed in its 2011 report on the rule of law and the 2016 rule of law checklist. As these are the most recent documents of a Council of Europe expert body dealing with the issue, the Assembly shall refer to them. Some other proposed amendments aim at adding some legal and terminological clarifications and to promoting cooperation with other international organizations. As far as I have been informed, our proposals have been positively received by the reporting committee, so I hope that the Assembly will support the report by Madam Estrela, including also amendments tabled by the Legal Affairs Committee. Thank you, President.
Thank you very, very much. That concludes the introduction by the rapporteurs. May I call on Vice President Mereshko to take over and to manage the speakers on behalf of the political groups, followed by the list of speakers. Thanks again on my behalf and on behalf of the Assembly for the enormous work that you have been doing, also the colleagues in the afternoon. But I think it is true that if we get all of this through, we will be living I guess a historic moment. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, we continue our work. We have a list of speakers. First, speakers on behalf of political groups, and I call first Mr. Reis Frédéric from France. Please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, Mesdames et Messieurs les rapporteurs, au nom du groupe PPE, je tiens tout d'abord à vous remercier toutes et tous pour vos éclairages respectifs sur les différents aspects de l'impact du changement climatique sur les droits de l'homme. Les catastrophes qui se sont succédées cet été ont démontré, si cela était encore nécessaire, que ce sujet est prioritaire. Inondations, glissements de terrain, canicules, incendies, ouragans, toutes les régions du monde sont désormais touchées et la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique s'impose comme une évidence. L'objectif à atteindre a été fixé par l'accord de Paris entré en vigueur en 2016. Il nous faut réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre afin de parvenir à la neutralité carbone d'ici 2050. L'impact de ces phénomènes extrêmes sur les migrations s'annonce d'ores et déjà comme difficilement soutenable par nos populations. L'accroissement des inégalités qu'ils induisent est tout aussi préoccupant. Nous devons inscrire nos réflexions dans le cadre des 17 objectifs de développement durable des Nations Unies. C'est l'honneur de notre Assemblée de débattre aujourd'hui de ces questions à quelques semaines de la COP 26. Nous souscrivons aux conclusions de la rapporteure sur crise climatique et état de droit quand elle souligne au paragraphe 6 du projet de résolution l'importance du rôle des parlements. Développer une démocratie plus participative, oui, mais pour moi, une convention citoyenne seule ne peut pas remplacer des débats parlementaires, voire des débats interparlementaires. Et l'idée de réseau parlementaire est tout à fait intéressante. En revanche, nous sommes plus circonspects sur les propositions de notre rapporteur pour ancrer le droit à un environnement sain dans l'ordonnancement juridique international. Bien sûr, l'idée d'élaborer des protocoles additionnels à la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme et à la Charte sociale européenne qui soient spécifiques sur ce sujet peut paraître séduisante. Néanmoins, ce type de processus, qui par définition se heurterait à des intérêts multiples et opposés, pourrait ne jamais aboutir. L'urgence commande plutôt d'œuvrer de manière plus pragmatique en recherchant l'efficacité. Et de ce point de vue, l'élaboration d'un instrument non contraignant sur les obligations des États en matière climatique et de protection de l'environnement pourrait être utile et complémentaire aux engagements existants. Cette démarche relèverait plutôt de l'ordre du signal ou du symbole, c'est vrai, mais elle présenterait l'avantage de pouvoir être élaborée rapidement et de faire consensus assez rapidement. Il est important d'ouvrir le champ des possibles. Le chantier de la lutte contre le changement climatique est immense, mais nous avons l'obligation de relever ce défi si nous voulons transmettre à nos enfants une planète vivable et un environnement sain. Nous voterons l'ensemble des résolutions et recommandations proposées ce matin. Je vous remercie.
Merci. And now I call Madame Liliana Tanguy from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, les inondations et incendies qui ont ravagé l'Europe cet été nous rappellent que notre continent n'est pas moins vulnérable aux conséquences du changement climatique et qu'il est urgent d'agir. Il faut saluer à cet égard le volontarisme et la détermination du président Dims pour placer la question de l'environnement et les droits humains en haut de l'agenda politique de notre Assemblée. Ce débat conjoint nous permet d'aborder la question du droit à un environnement sain, sûr et durable sous différents angles, à partir de plusieurs rapports très riches et assortis de multiples pistes de travail pour que le Conseil de l'Europe apporte une réponse à la hauteur des enjeux pour les prochaines générations d'Européens. Et nous souhaitons être leaders en la matière. Le groupe ALDE partage les conclusions des rapporteurs et apportera son soutien. La question est désormais d'explorer le champ des possibles livrables proposés dans ces rapports. Quels seront les instruments susceptibles d'ancrer véritablement le droit à l'environnement sain, de réunir le plus large soutien politique nécessaire à la protection de ce bien public mondial et d'entrer en vigueur dans un délai raisonnable compte tenu de l'urgence climatique et environnementale. L'option ambitieuse serait de lancer un vaste chantier autour de nouveaux protocoles additionnels à la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme et à la Charte sociale européenne et autres conventions de type 5P sur les menaces pour l'environnement et les risques pour la santé. Sur un champ plus étroit et à plus court terme, la proposition d'une révision et d'une revitalisation de la Convention sur la protection de l'environnement par le droit pénal de 1998 mérite toute notre attention. Une actualisation permettant l'entrée en vigueur de cet instrument du Conseil de l'Europe pourrait intervenir à plus brève échéance et permettre à nos systèmes judiciaires de punir les infractions environnementales les plus graves de manière effective et unifiée à l'échelle du continent. Nos discussions interviennent opportunément à quelques semaines de la clôture du Forum mondial de la démocratie les 8 et 10 novembre à Strasbourg sur le thème « La démocratie au secours de l'environnement ». À travers la Convention citoyenne pour le climat, la France a elle-même expérimenté avec succès un exercice de démocratie participative autour de 150 citoyens tirés au sort ayant formulé 149 propositions concrètes à partir desquelles vient d'être votée en août dernier la loi dite « Climat et résilience » qui contient pas moins de 300 articles pour contribuer à l'objectif européen de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de 55% d'ici 2030, dans un esprit de justice sociale, bien sûr. Et cette loi française, dont j'ai été le rapporteur pour observation, crée notamment de nouveaux délits de mise en danger de l'environnement et d'écocide. Alors aujourd'hui, les commissions de notre Assemblée et le Conseil de l'Europe nous incitent à agir pour le climat. Il nous appartient désormais d'être les leaders que l'humanité et la planète attendent. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And now I call Ms. Nigar Arpadarai from Azerbaijan.
Dear colleagues, I thank you all for this timely discussion. Let me draw your attention to a few critical points that I believe should guide us as parliamentarians in further steps in this important direction. First, global green agenda means a lot of changes: regulatory, technological, behavioral. It switches on the marathon of lawmaking, new regulations in all countries and developing international covenants which will support and promote new environmental standards. It is absolutely clear that humanity needs to stop polluting the planet. But how do we make sure that these new regulations does not become a toy in the hands of rich and powerful against weak and poor? New ecological standards will mean more expensive entry tickets into industries. What should we do in order to make sure that it's not going to be hijacked by large transnational conglomerates as opposed to small and medium businesses? Large companies own R&D and they run it through complex and expensive licensing and maintenance schemes, which are unaffordable for smaller entities. And this question does not only apply to commercial entities. How do we make sure that this agenda is not being abused by rich countries who have more access to capital and modern technologies in order to create competitive edge over poorer countries? Is there even a slightest risk that green agenda, however good and benevolent its goals are, may turn into a tool for inequality among nations? The answer is obvious. Yes, there is such risk. To avoid it, there should be fair rules for access to technology and financing for the green technologies across wider Europe and across the globe. And we should make sure that this point is well heard. There's also a vital human dimension to the above said. Just like with countries, how do we make sure that this massive change in how we live, in produce, consume, does not reflect in unaffordability of goods and services for the poor? Another dimension is education. There should be a clear explanation of what measures, changes of laws and standards mean. Small businesses should be educated well in advance of any upcoming or planned changes and their practical consequences. It will give them time to adapt. We should promote more affordability of green solutions for SMEs. Dear colleagues, at every step of this process, we should do sanity checks of what is being suggested and also a throughout diligence in order to make sure that we are not being manipulated. The new world contains both challenges and opportunities, and we have to make sure that poor and vulnerable are protected and prepared. After all, this is our job as parliamentarians, to make sure that justice and equality is ensured. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call Ms. Maiki Vella from Finland.
Ms. President, dear colleagues, this is my first time and my first speech here at the Palais. First of all, there are no human rights on a dead planet. Without safeguarding the environment, we will not be able to advance human rights or any other progressive politics. Also, people in Europe have seen how the right to a safe environment is being compromised through floods, droughts, and wildfires. If we fail our environment, we fail to protect our human rights. This is crystal clear to an environmental refugee who forced to leave home and to a farmer who is losing his yield. So it needs to be clear to us as well. Environmental rights also mean that people can have their say on environmental issues and have the right to demand environmental justice. It includes rights such as access to information, citizens' participation in decision-making, and accountability. Leaders need to be accountable if failing to put environmental action forward. People should be entitled to have more ways to participate. These areas are well covered in the reports, and I thank all the rapporteurs for their work. The environmental rights are part of a new generation of human rights, and now it is our responsibility to give meaning to it. The first report suggests that the Council of Europe should adapt its legal framework accordingly, including anchoring the environmental rights into the European Convention on Human Rights. Our group strongly supports the view, and now is the time to put these ideas into action. We also need to look at the cause of the environmental crisis, which is our unsustainable economic system that demands the overconsumption and exploitation of nature. We need to hold companies accountable for environmental destruction and at the same time put a stop on the ongoing massive greenwashing. Also, better protection of the rights of environmental human rights defenders whose lives are in danger is needed. I would also like to remind us that in the context of ecological crises, the anthropocentric approach is problematic in itself. We should have legal mechanisms which would better reflect that we respect other species as well. If we want to be pioneers in advancing the right to life, we need to acknowledge that also non-human species should have rights that are relevant to them. So, a holistic approach that puts the rights of all living beings before profit is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me to congratulate on your first speech and to wish you many, many more excellent speeches in the hemicycle. Thank you. And now I call Mr. Fura Benchika from Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to congratulate all rapporteurs, and especially my dear colleague from Belgium, Simon, for his excellent work. Colleagues, Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. Environmental protection is still an inadequate guarantee to this day. The right to a safe, clean and healthy and sustainable environment should be self-evident, but that is unfortunately not the case. Your environment should not cause you harm or illness, nor should people be displaced from their homes as a result from climate crisis. The environment should therefore be a priority at the top of everyone's agenda because it concerns every one of us. The climate marches remind us that the next generation demanding one thing, a future, one that is not under constant threat. Young people today share that the lack of perspective for the future makes them question whether they even bring children in this world. They are afraid to put the next generation into the world that is bleeding, a planet that cannot longer take it. I understand their concerns. But colleagues, we must not give in into fatalism. We can tackle these challenges if we act now. This report advises a roadmap for actions, so we need to move forward and work together as member states to prevent and prosecute violation of the right to a safe, clean and healthy environment. The environment does not stop at our national borders. The fight against the climate crisis is a global one, and therefore, more than ever, we need cooperation. And as it concerns every single of us, I believe we all share the same interest in leaving behind a better planet for our children, for our loved ones. Colleagues, let us not wait until the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish have been caught to realize we cannot eat money. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we continue with the list of speakers, and I call Ms. Marina Berlinghieri from Italy.
Sì, grazie Presidente. La crisi climatica sta aggravando le disuguaglianze globali, sia per quanto riguarda l'accesso alle risorse ambientali che nel carico di costi di riduzione delle emissioni, accentuando i fenomeni di migrazione, scatenando carestie, pandemie e sempre più frequenti emergenze umanitarie. È dunque necessaria un'azione comune, multilaterale, forte e urgente perché l'accesso al diritto fondamentale a un ambiente salubre e sicuro sia più equamente condiviso tra regioni, paesi, differenti generazioni e singoli individui. La crisi climatica esaspera gli effetti di altre crisi in atto e rappresenta un pericolo sistemico anche per le società e le istituzioni. Un accesso equo alle risorse ambientali rappresenta una garanzia di stabilità geopolitica. Dobbiamo arrivare in tempi molto brevi alla definizione di un nuovo concetto di diritto ambientale universalmente riconosciuto. È fondamentale che ciascuna istituzione, dai parlamenti nazionali alle istituzioni internazionali multilaterali, porti il contributo nella consapevolezza che, come ci dicono i nostri figli, è finito il tempo delle chiacchiere. Dobbiamo essere coraggiosi. Sostenere il lavoro del Consiglio d'Europa oggi può fare la differenza. Grazie.
Thank you. And now I call Mr. François Calvet from France, who will be joined online. Who will join us online, please. No? Yeah, we move on, yes. So, and now I call Madame Serap Yassar from Turkey.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, le changement climatique est un impact sur la vie et la santé humaine de diverses manières. Rien que cet été, de graves vagues de chaleur ont causé la mort de centaines de personnes aux États-Unis et au Canada. Des inondations ont dévasté l'Allemagne et la Chine. Et il y a eu de graves incendies de forêts en Sibérie, en Turquie et en Grèce. Alors que le changement climatique s'intensifie, il est plus que nécessaire de tenir une lumière sur ces impacts. Je tiens à remercier le rapporteur, M. Altun Yıldız, pour son rapport de grande qualité qui touche à un territoire juridique inexploré. Le contentieux climatique pourrait jouer un rôle immense dans la discussion des crimes environnementaux et dans la responsabilité légale des auteurs de ces crimes. Cependant, comme les crimes contre l'environnement sont généralement de nature internationale, la coopération internationale est indispensable pour concevoir des instruments juridiques et des recours efficaces de remédiation. Le rapporteur souligne à juste titre la nécessité d'introduire un mécanisme de droit pénal unifié établissant des définitions communes des infractions pénales et des sanctions associées, y compris des sanctions financières dissuasives. Ce rapport est un pas dans la bonne direction pour encourager les États membres à prendre sans tarder les mesures nécessaires. La vague actuelle de litiges climatiques démontre que le nombre de cas en Europe et dans le monde est en augmentation. Dans ce contexte, le Conseil de l'Europe devrait jouer un rôle de premier plan dans l'élaboration de normes internationales pour les litiges climatiques. Ce rapport sert avec succès l'exemple sur la façon d'aborder ce nouveau domaine juridique qui mérite toute notre attention en raison de l'intensification du changement climatique. Merci pour votre attention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. And now I call Mr. Dimitri Houbron from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Madame, Messieurs les rapporteurs, mes chers collègues. Nous devons avoir l'honnêteté de reconnaître que les circonstances sanitaires actuelles ne facilitent pas l'enracinement d'une prise de conscience relative à la crise climatique. D'une part, face à la flambée épidémique, la majorité des gouvernements ont dû prendre des mesures de restriction de libertés individuelles et collectives comme le confinement, des décisions radicales qui poussent les États à ralentir la prise de nouvelles mesures écologiques. En effet, de nombreux acteurs nationaux assimilent trop souvent les politiques publiques environnementales à des mesures liberticides. La surtaxe de certains véhicules, l'interdiction de bâtir dans certaines zones, les débats sur la fréquence et les motifs de déplacement en avion, mal expliqués ou imposés sans concertation, ces dispositifs sont vivement rejetés parce qu'ils remettent en question des droits fondamentaux, comme le droit à la propriété ou encore à la liberté de circulation. D'une part, la fin progressive de la crise sanitaire a motivé les États à relancer leur économie le plus rapidement possible, parfois au détriment des réglementations environnementales. Le rapport d'ailleurs mentionne l'exemple de l'ancienne administration américaine qui a fait annuler toutes les poursuites pour infractions fédérales contre l'environnement. Ces faits nous rappellent que la volonté d'opposer l'environnement avec l'état de droit et le bien-être économique et social demeurent tenaces. Notre objectif est de démontrer, plus que jamais au lendemain de cette crise sanitaire, que la défense de l'environnement permet de sauvegarder nos droits et d'améliorer nos conditions de vie. Des pays comme la France ont fondé leur plan de relance économique sur la transition écologique. Ainsi, sur un budget global de 100 milliards d'euros, 30 sont dédiés à des aides pour l'isolation thermique des logements, l'acquisition des véhicules propres ou encore des soutiens aux petites et moyennes entreprises. Il nous appartient de démontrer que la lutte contre la crise climatique peut s'appuyer sur la préservation de droits, mais aussi que le changement climatique, lui, menace nos droits. Comme le rappelle Amnesty International, le dérèglement climatique met en péril notre droit à la vie, notre droit à la santé, notre droit au logement et notre droit à l'accès à l'eau. En réalité, c'est bel et bien la crise climatique qui menace notre modèle d'état de droit. C'est donc à partir de cette analyse que le Conseil de l'Europe peut prendre des initiatives en concertation avec les institutions de l'Union européenne. L'objectif consisterait à élaborer un corpus juridique commun qui puisse servir de modèle et de source d'inspiration pour les États membres désireux de se lancer dans la transition écologique tout en évitant l'atteinte aux libertés fondamentales comme la liberté d'entreprendre. Nous pourrions aussi, à partir de ce constat, ériger des cadres, des plans et des objectifs environnementaux chiffrés qui donnent toute la souplesse nécessaire au gouvernement pour y parvenir. Bien que les 18 derniers mois furent éprouvants, je crois qu'une réelle prise de conscience s'est enracinée. Les États-Unis sont revenus dans les accords de Paris et la crise épidémique a démontré notre capacité de rupture pour préserver l'intérêt général. Continuons à tirer les leçons et poursuivons nos efforts collectifs. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. I call now Mr. Barnapal Sigmund from Hungary.
Thank you, Mr. President, dear colleagues. The speed and extent of environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, and the climate crisis that directly impact on human health, dignity, and life are highly concerning developments, as we have heard. As the European continent's leading human rights and rule of law organization, the Council of Europe should stay proactive and adapt its legal framework accordingly to stand up for the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. During the COVID pandemic, it is highly important not to forget that the environmental situation on our Earth is getting more and more serious and is becoming one of the biggest challenges facing the planet. The Hungarian government and our president, Mr. János Áder, who is coming here today, are doing everything in their power to reach these goals of a sustainable environment. That is why environmental challenges is one of the 5 priorities that Hungarian presidency is focusing on. The Hungarian government launched its National Clean Development Strategy to reach the target to be a climate-neutral state by 2050. This deadline has also been enshrined in law. Hungary reduced carbon emission by 32% in 20 years. This achievement puts the country in the top 3 European Union emission slashers. All this time, our economic growth is unprecedented. In 5 years, the capacity of Hungary's solar power plants increased tenfold. The aim is that 90% of the electricity generated in Hungary would be carbon-free by 2030. Dear colleagues, the main question is who will pay the cost of climate change? We believe that large polluters, such as multinational companies, should bear the cost of climate protection. Our government considers it especially important to help the poorest households and care for the workers affected by the transition process. Climate change is a local, national, regional, and global challenge, which requires everyone to play their part. Europe cannot solve this problem on its own, but we can show a good example for the world. However, a green transition can only be achieved with widespread social support. That's why our government promotes individual and social responsibility and social participation. In Hungary, sustainability is part of the school curriculum, which helps participatory democracy to tackle climate change. To sum up, I support that the Council of Europe to stay proactive and should contribute with proposals for further discussions and legislation in the national and European context. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I call Ms. Selin Sayek-Böke from Turkey.
Thank you very much. Clearly, without a healthy environment, we're unable to even live at a level commensurate with minimum standards of human dignity. And we face a deep crisis in this regard, a crisis of climate, a catastrophic level of global heating. And clearly, it's important to properly frame the issue at stake in order to properly identify the policy response to be uptaken. The risks are very high. The destruction of wild spaces facilitates the emergence of zoonotic diseases. We are prone to new pandemics. Air pollution reduces quality of health and lowers life expectancy. Biodiversity loss compromises the nutritional value of food, and it also reduces the scope and efficacy of medicines. Most importantly, a lack of effective legal regulation and enforcement of industrial and artisanal mining, large-scale dams, deforestation, domestic water and sanitation systems, heavily polluting industries lead to a host of economic destruction, but most importantly, human rights violations. And in order to overcome such violations, clearly, we need to adapt our legal frameworks and we need to change our economic model, making sure we embrace the new needs of human rights. And clearly, all reports we're voting for today are part of this holistic and complementary approach that we've just described, which includes ensuring that participatory new processes and practices are established for a true democratic process, where deliberation will ensure full participation, full voices being heard, but most importantly, that those voices actually become policies. We also need to ensure that we have a proper legal framework set in our rule of law frameworks to enshrine a rights-based framework, which is much needed for a just transition. We don't just seek to transition, we seek that it's fair and equitable. We need to make sure that our organization has our conventions to provide for an umbrella framework that is much needed for the democratic and legal processes to be effective in solution of a global issue. And these conditions are set up through 4 very critical resolutions that we will be voting for today, and we should strongly support them. I'd like to end by reminding, as the chairperson of the Subcommittee on the European Social Charter, what we're speaking of today is also very relevant for our social rights. Therefore, we should hold on to our charter. These social rights, the right to protection of health, the right to protection against poverty, the right to housing, are strongly related to the right to a healthy environment. I support that idea that draft additional protocols to the Convention and the Charter be actually the next step we take, and I support and congratulate all rapporteurs.
Thank you. And now I call Mr. Corneliu Mugurel Cosmanciuc from Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I would like to begin by stressing that promotion of the human rights rooted in human dignity and a healthy and sustainable planet are interdependent. It is important that the Council of Europe member states act as a credible and reliable partner of the global stage through to the adoption of training and implementation of legislation aligned with a comprehensive human rights-based approach to climate action. The mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur of Human Rights and the environment to push for a global recognition of the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment as a human right is very important, and we need to support the global recognition of this right. The recognition should serve as a catalyst for stronger environmental policies, improved law enforcement, public participation in environmental decision-making, access to information on justice and the better outcomes for people on the planet. I believe that in creating the human right to a healthy environment in key environmental agreements and process is critical to a holistic response to COVID-19 that include the conceptualization of the relationship between people and nature that will reduce risk and prevent future harm and for the environmental degradation. The global COVID-19 pandemic perfectly illustrates the impact of the environmental degradation in creating the condition for increase of diseases and severe health, social, economic and political consequences. I express my deep concern that a global recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic might lower delay and commitment towards international climate objectives and human rights standards. This is why we can no longer wait to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call Ms. Margrethe de Boer from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Chair. Humanity stands at crossroads. Scientific evidence shows that the destruction of ecosystems and current rates will have catastrophic consequences for our environment. This directly impacts human health, dignity, and life. The resolutions under discussion today guide the way for future approaches to the climate crisis. In this, they encompass several routes towards progress: international legal standards, political action, and more grassroots approach of participatory democracy. It is evident that legal developments can contribute to the protection of our Earth. In the Netherlands, we have seen a clear example of this, with the Supreme Court of the Netherlands issuing a landmark decision in the case of Agenda versus the State, confirming that the Dutch government had acted unlawfully in taking insufficient action to prevent dangerous climate change. The state was ordered to immediately reduce its greenhouse gas emission. The measures suggested in the resolutions on the right to a healthy environment and on criminal and civil liability will support individuals in holding states accountable for their environmental obligations and will enable stronger standards for corporate responsibility. This is necessary. In addition, I believe that we should broaden our view towards these legal standards. The climate crisis does not only impact individuals, but has a strong effect on groups of people. Think of, for example, of people living in hard-hit areas. In this frame, it could be beneficial to investigate the possibilities for creating a collective complaint procedure regarding the right to a healthy environment. Also, the climate crisis is not only a crisis of our current generation. The action we do or do not take will have an enormous impact on the Earth that future generations will inherit from us. Therefore, I also believe it too important that we consider the legal possibilities to serve this interest of future generations. The importance of collective impacts of the climate crisis is well reflected in the report on participatory democracy. As a global issue that touches on all lives, the solutions to climate change also need to be rooted in broad support and understanding. Including measures of participatory democracy in climate policy making would be a good way to ensure this support, as well as combat the misinformation, mistrust, and apathy that often dominate public climate debate. Let me end with thanking all the rapporteurs for their important reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I call Ms. Yelizaveta Yasko from Ukraine, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to refer to everyone who is in this hall to ask you to think. We're talking about environment, but isn't it our task to think about the effect of that environmental change and threats to our lives and human rights? And is it our task here or no to actually make our member states to be responsible for that damage that states and different companies can do to environment? Can we impose new rules, maybe, to that states that really violate the rules around environment? Of course, I want to mention such very loud projects as, for example, Nord Stream 2 and its threat that it causes to ecosystem of the Baltic Sea. I'm not talking about just political consequences, but just environment. The same about the construction of the Belarus nuclear plant that is only 45 kilometers from Vilnius, Lithuania. And it is built against all international standards in the field of environment protection and is unsafe. Also, if we talk about Crimea that is annexed and occupied, the Kerch Bridge that was built Shall we look at the numbers of how many species were killed and died after that? How much damage it caused to the flora and fauna? What about the militarization and how many trees have died after that? Unfortunately, I have an impression that states that really violate these rules, they are not interested in life. They are interested sometimes, as for example in occupied Crimea, the Russian authorities are now interested in having a land that has no life and no fauna and flora. And this is very sad. And to protect that and to change that, I really think we need to think about the new rules that we all can impose on interstate level. Thank you.
Merci. And now I call Mr. Alexander Bashkin from Russian Federation. He will join us online. Please, Mr. Alexander.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Предшествующее выступление несколько скорректировало мои планы. Благодарю оратора предшествующего за то, что она упомянула Крым. Действительно, можно поговорить о том, как украинские власти перекрыли Северный Крымский канал, лишив воды населения целого полуострова. Так, заботясь о крымчанах, на самом деле мы видим о том, что лишенные воды крымчане взрывают газопроводы с территории соседнего государства, а также подрывает линии электропередач. Вот как заботится на самом деле об экологии страна, представитель которой только что выступал. Ну а теперь о самом вопросе. Современный перечень угроз для цивилизации, конечно, хорошо известен. И в этом списке на первом месте стоят изменения климата. В этом смысле особо важно, что сегодняшний день пленарной сессии целиком посвящен предложениям по устранению этих вызовов. Однако, чтобы предложения были жизнеспособны, нужно их не только хвалить, но и критически изучать и корректировать слабые стороны. В этой связи скажу несколько слов по содержанию доклада уважаемого господина Симона Муткам. Проекты документов нацелены на закрепление экологических прав человека в правовой базе Совета Европы в формате юридически обязывающих документов. Однако хочу напомнить, что в рамках руководящего комитета Совета Европы по правам человека уже создана рабочая группа и по правам человека и окружающей среды, которой поручено к концу этого года представить в Комитет министров проект юридически не обязывающего документа по данной теме. До ознакомления с выводами рабочей группы какая-либо дискуссия в рамках ПАСЕ на эту тему может быть и преждевременно. Хотел бы, исключив политические оценки, критически взглянуть на некоторые позиции проектов с беспристрастной юридической стороны. Например, не выдерживает критики включение в проект резолюции рекомендаций, далеких от экологического права, концепций и терминов. Например, искусственный интеллект или нанотехнологии. Проект протокола к ЕКПЧ не согласуются с другими дополнительными, уже существующими протоколами конвенции с точки зрения юридической техники. Вопросы вызывает несвойственная для протокола структура документа, но еще и содержательное наполнение. Например, возложение обязательств по защите окружающей среды на поколения, которые не являются субъектом международного права, или включение статьи «Процессуальные права» в подраздел «Материальное право». В проекте доклада и резолюции используются термины, являющиеся спорными. Например, environmental justice. Неквалифицированный термин в международном праве. В докладе содержание этого термина не раскрывается. Завершить хочу коротким замечанием к докладу «Больше демократии участия для борьбы с изменением климата». Концепция демократии участия. Не уверен, что это нововведение отвечает Уставу Совета Европы. Дело в том, что нужно помнить, в наших странах действует другая форма демократии, представительная демократия. И ПАСЕ — это тоже орган представительной демократии. Благодарю вас за внимание. Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. And now I call Madame Nicole Tries from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs les rapporteurs, chers collègues. Pour la troisième fois, notre Assemblée tient une journée entière de débat sur un thème essentiel et particulièrement actuel pour les droits humains. Après la pandémie du Covid-19 et ses effets, puis l'intelligence artificielle il y a un an, nous appréhendons aujourd'hui un ensemble de défis posés par le changement climatique pour nos sociétés, nos systèmes démocratiques, nos États et le multilatéralisme en général. À cet égard, je tiens à féliciter l'ensemble des rapporteurs pour la qualité de leurs réflexions. Incontestablement, le dérèglement du climat engendre d'ores et déjà des mouvements migratoires et des inégalités criantes qui ne pourront que s'aggraver si la tendance s'amplifie. Par ailleurs, la crise climatique impacte aussi fortement l'état de droit et le fonctionnement de nos démocraties, de sorte qu'il nous appartient d'esquisser des pistes de solutions pour nous prémunir de retours en arrière politiques ou institutionnels qui seraient très préjudiciables. De ce point de vue, 2 rapports établis par nos collègues Georges Papandréou et Olivier Becht me paraissent porteurs d'espoir en proposant des mesures concrètes, pertinentes et pragmatiques. Le premier, qui appelle à une démocratie plus participative, entre en résonance avec des expériences récentes, plutôt réussies, n'en déplaise à mon interlocuteur précédent. Je ne prendrai à cet égard que l'exemple de la Convention citoyenne pour le climat, initiée par le président de la République française en 2019, et qui a été composée de 150 citoyens tirés au sort pour trouver des mesures permettant de réduire de 40% les émissions à effet de serre de la France d'ici 2030. Au bout de 8 mois, sur les 149 mesures proposées, 146 ont été reprises et nous en avons fait, avec des débats bien sûr avec l'Assemblée nationale et le Sénat, une loi sur la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique et renforcement de la résilience face à ses effets, qui a été promulguée en août dernier. Le second rapport, établi par notre collègue Olivier Becht, dresse des perspectives très intéressantes en matière de recherche et de coopération interétatique sur les défis environnementaux. Je souscris pleinement à l'idée de développer des programmes de recherche spécifiques sur le recyclage et les énergies renouvelables, tout en maintenant les projets de recherche fondamentales sur de nouvelles sources d'énergie durables. Je partage également les conclusions concernant les financements, mais surtout, je rejoins le rapporteur sur l'ambition d'un cadre, sous la forme d'un accord partiel élargi par exemple, permettant aux États membres du Conseil de l'Europe de mutualiser leurs moyens de recherche pour des projets ciblés en faveur de la transition énergétique. Chers collègues, après les tensions connues au sein de notre organisation ces dernières années, il y a là, me semble-t-il, le germe d'une relance fondamentale de l'esprit des pères fondateurs à l'échelle de nos 47 États membres, car l'enjeu dépasse de loin nos frontières et réunit indubitablement nos intérêts. En définitive, par ce débat, la PCE apporte sa pierre à l'édifice de la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique et je voterai bien sûr sans réserve les résolutions et recommandations élaborées par nos commissions qui toutes sont à la hauteur de nos enjeux. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. And now I call Mr. John Howell from the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to raise a number of concerns on the participatory democracy paper. The rapporteur, I think, quite correctly identifies a number of problems, but these are not wholly associated with climate change. For example, one of the problems he raises is how do we engage in politics with young people? How do we get them to participate in politics? How do we take their ideas and develop those ideas into policy? The solution that the paper comes up with is essentially a citizens' assembly. Now, I don't know whether there is a difference of culture amongst the many countries that are represented here, but we already have a citizens' assembly. It is called the House of Commons. And it comes with a strong mandate that individual MPs cannot be directed as if they were delegates. They are representatives, and they are alone responsible for taking an action in a particular area. This is a tradition and a philosophy which has lasted many, many more than 300 years. We should not undermine our parliaments or our MPs. As I said, they have the right to come up with ideas. And where will this end? Will we have citizens' assemblies on every subject? In which case, what is the value of Parliament? And what is the value of MPs, full stop? Of course, MPs take ideas from many different sources. And I have regular meetings with groups across my own constituency in the UK to be able to ascertain what their views are. But it is my decision as to what I support in the voting in the House of Commons. Now, in the UK, we have a government which has already moved fast and far on the issue of climate change. It was the first to introduce a net zero targets. And of course, it is hosting COP26 shortly, which I'm sure we all hope will be a great success. But I do not believe that a citizens' assembly is essentially about democracy. I think that we need to find other ways of encouraging young people to participate with MPs and with their parliaments. And I cannot see any advantage in the citizens' assemblies that have been tried around the world that cannot be exercised by traditional policy making. They have, for example, had no long-lasting results. And for that reason, I have grave concerns with the idea of citizens' assemblies.
Thank you. I call now Madame Marietta Caramanli from France. Is she here in the hemicycle?
Vous m'entendez? Oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mes chers collègues, je souhaite tout d'abord adresser tous mes remerciements aux 4 rapporteurs pour les analyses et propositions dans des sujets finalement qui travaillent dans cette complémentarité autour des questions de crise sanitaire et de crise climatique. Je souhaite plus particulièrement insister sur 2 rapports, celui de notre collègue Moutquin, rapporteur, pour le remercier pour ses propositions tendant à renforcer les dispositifs et conventions du Conseil de l'Europe en matière donc de droit, un environnement sain, et Madame Edith Estrella pour ses observations et suggestions visant à renforcer l'état de droit face à la crise climatique. J'arrête sur ces 2 rapports car j'aurais souhaité aussi porter 2 propositions en complément de celles exposées. La première est relative à la nécessité d'instaurer un objectif de protection climatique dans les traités commerciaux et internationaux. La deuxième est celle de donner un statut à ce qu'on appelle les biens communs. Au premier cas, il apparaît indispensable de tenir compte des préoccupations sociales et environnementales dans le cadre des échanges économiques et commerciaux internationaux. Des traités sont désormais conclus et seront conclus encore pour assurer l'accès de biens et services à des zones économiques. Si ces traités visent à faciliter les échanges économiques, ils sont parfois moins protecteurs que le droit local en matière de défense de l'environnement et de la santé. Il convient donc de faire en sorte que le droit à un environnement sain soit garanti au regard de la multiplication des échanges qu'entraîne de facto leur conclusion. Il est suggéré que ces projets de traités puissent faire l'objet d'une évaluation indépendante avant leur conclusion sous forme de bilan carbone et aussi d'évaluation du maintien de la biodiversité. Mon autre observation vise à donner un statut de bien commun à des ressources naturelles partagées entre tous les États. Ce concept de bien commun, autrement dit de ressources partagées et gérées collectivement par une communauté, doit être réactualisé. Si la propriété privée fait figure de pierre angulaire du droit dans un grand nombre de sociétés et d'États depuis 2 siècles, il constitue aussi une protection avérée pour les personnes, leur liberté, et il est aujourd'hui nécessaire de retrouver et garantir le statut de bien commun à des ressources naturelles. Cette notion a existé en droit romain et encore dans la législation du Moyen-Âge, et des exemples sont nombreux. Ils sont autant de biens pour lesquels justement une réflexion nouvelle et innovante doit être menée en droit pour garantir l'accès au plus grand nombre à tous. Et au-delà de la définition d'un nouveau statut, c'est aussi une protection renouvelée de l'état de droit au service de la démocratie à laquelle nous travaillons alors. Donc notre Assemblée a le pouvoir et le devoir d'agir en ce sens, et je vous remercie vraiment tous pour le travail que vous avez fourni, et nous restons attentifs aux évolutions attendues.
Merci beaucoup. And now I call Ms. Larisa Bilazir from Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, dear Mr. Mareshka, I would like to thank all reporters for their excellent comprehensive reports where they revealed very important problems very thoroughly about climate crisis, about climate justice, environmental problems, and all of us were united in one that we need to take action now and that we need to act now. I would like to tell you about one of the largest rivers in Europe, the Dnieper River. It is an important transport artery of Ukraine, as well as source of fresh water for me, my children, and for 70% of population of Ukraine. Despite this summer, 161 pollutants were detected in the surface water of the Dnieper River, in particular cadmium, nickel metals, radioactive elements, agricultural pesticides. Every year, there is a systematic deterioration in the ecological state of the rivers. And now the Dnieper River is is on the verge of irreversible environmental catastrophe, as many other rivers in Europe. And next generations of people may not see clean water in the rivers. Of course, the government of Ukraine is implementing measures to improve the health of the Dnieper River basin, but there are not enough, nor are there enough legislative mechanisms to preserve a clean and sustainable environment. And the legislative mechanisms need to be improved. In this context, the Assembly concerns about the rate and extent of environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, and the climate crisis, which directly affects human health, dignity, and life, is extremely relevant. The Council of Europe must demonstrate a clear position and strategic vision for the future and improve legislation to strengthen environmental protection, which is extremely necessary in the era of systemic environmental threats to present and future generations. Improving legislation will be an adequate response in the context of responding to the rapid deterioration of the environment, loss of biodiversity, and the threat of the climate crisis, which directly affect people's health, dignity, and life. The Ukrainian delegation supports the development of additional protocols to the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Social Charter, which are necessary for additional guarantee of the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and will help the member states of the Council of Europe more effectively achieve the goals set out in the framework of the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I call Mr. George Loukaides from Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Dear colleagues, allow me to also thank the rapporteurs for their excellent work on climate change. Today's agenda is of utmost importance. Dedicating a whole day of the session to these very important issues demonstrates the resolve of the Assembly to effectively contribute to this debate. Undoubtedly, we are facing a large-scale ecological crisis, which threatens our lives and livelihoods, our societies and economies, maritime and terrestrial biodiversity. The lowest strands of our societies, including the poorest and the most vulnerable groups, are those who are most heavily impacted by the climate crisis. At the global level, dear colleagues, the escalating conflicts over natural resources and the impending flows of climate refugees are probably the strongest evidence of this intersectional threat to people and the environment. In the Mediterranean region in particular, the parallel crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss are reflected through wildfires. Today, amidst the increasing heat waves and the subsequent droughts, that threat is spreading all over Europe, with more and more countries now facing these new and unexpected pressures. Allow me to say that the root causes of these imminent threats are closely interlinked with the current socio-economic system that sets as priority profits over environmental sustainability and the people's well-being. In these urgent circumstances, we cannot ensure, dear colleagues, social justice without environmental justice. At the same time, environmental justice cannot be met without social justice, as well as international and intergenerational solidarity. As one of our rapporteurs, Mr. Mutkin, correctly notes, these new threats to human life, our collective well-being and our health do not stem only from national governments' failure to uphold civic and political rights, but also from their lack of action to prevent cumulative harm to all living creatures from environmental degradation due to the commercial exploitation of nature. Given the above circumstances, an additional protocol to the Convention is urgently needed in order to provide the Court with a solid framework for legal accountability against physical and legal persons committing environmental offences. In particular, the Court will have the jurisdiction to prosecute human rights violations resulting from environment-related negative effects on human health, dignity, and life. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call Madame Lucie Mencion from Canada. She will join us online.
Chers parlementaires, je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, de me permettre de m'adresser à cette Assemblée. Laissez-moi aussi vous remercier d'avoir dédié une journée complète de débat sur les questions de l'environnement, des changements climatiques et de leur impact sur nous et notre planète. Le rapport de M. Moutquin exhorte le Conseil de l'Europe à inscrire le droit à un environnement sûr, propre, sain et durable dans son cadre juridique. Cet appel est également lancé aux parlements nationaux membres. Je vais tout de suite vous faire le portrait du cadre juridique canadien qui repose entre autres sur des obligations internationales en matière de droits de la personne. La Constitution canadienne, contrairement à celle de nombreux autres pays, ne mentionne pas explicitement le droit à un environnement sain et sûr. Néanmoins, tous les efforts déployés par le gouvernement du Canada pour atténuer les changements climatiques et s'y adapter doivent respecter le droit à la vie et le droit à la sécurité protégés par la Constitution. De plus, en 1995, la Cour suprême du Canada a reconnu que la protection de l'environnement était devenue une valeur fondamentale et a désigné cette valeur comme le droit à un environnement sûr. Enfin, l'article 35 de la Charte canadienne reconnaît les droits ancestraux et issus de traités des peuples autochtones. Considérant que les changements climatiques ont une incidence sur l'exercice des droits ancestraux et issus de traités, plus particulièrement en ce qui concerne les droits qui reposent sur des pratiques traditionnelles d'utilisation des terres, les tribunaux canadiens ont reconnu depuis longtemps que ces droits requièrent souvent une protection du gouvernement pour éviter la dégradation de l'environnement. Ainsi, le gouvernement du Canada a l'obligation de consulter les groupes autochtones concernés et de trouver des accommodements à leurs intérêts sur les terres où ils détiennent des titres. Le Canada pourrait bâtir sur ces dispositions et mieux ancrer le droit à un environnement sûr, propre, sain et durable dans son cadre juridique. En l'intégrant solidement, nous veillons à ce que nos institutions et nos citoyens soient prêts à affronter les défis qu'apporteront les changements climatiques à l'avenir, mais également à tirer profit des nouvelles possibilités qui en résulteront. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci beaucoup. And now I call Ms. Petra Bayer from Austria.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm convinced this Assembly needs a general rapporteur on the protection of the environment and of the climate. We know that global heating is everywhere, but not everybody is affected in the same way. There are those who are living in poor houses, with close to streets with heavy traffic, with polluted air, hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and having no chance to seek refuge anywhere else. And there are these who live in better houses, in well-equipped houses. They can switch on the air condition. If they feel too hot or too cold, they can take the plane and go on holidays and flee from a hostile environment. And by taking a plane, they cause additional greenhouse gases, by the way. So we also know that the possibilities for adaptation mechanisms, how to get in line with global heating, how to adapt your living conditions, your crops, your way, how you work, how you live, is even very unequal. Those who are living close to the equator are much more affected than those in the north in general, but they lack any measures, any possibilities, any resources to pay for these technical solutions and to have adaptation mechanisms on having decent lives as well. So we know, because all the aid reports this day show that the protection of the climate is a cross-cutting issue across two very different political fields, political areas, and it is not only all over Europe, it's a global problem, of course, and I think that for tackling these, you really need a long breath, and we also see that especially all people are concerned. If you ask people in Europe what are their main concerns, global warming will come among the first 3 or 5 issues they are concerned of. And especially young people really take the chance, take the possibility to protest, to have a decent future as well, to have living conditions where they also can survive in a couple of years. And so I think especially in Europe, we have very different conditions when it comes to global heating. There are those with glaciers, for instance, like in Austria, in my country, and the glaciers are melting. There are those at the coastal areas where they really are endangered to lose some of their space, of their country, of their environment at all. So I think that a general rapporteur really could have the long brief and the impact and the face to a problem that we all are facing, and that we really need to act on politically on very different levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call Mr. Yuri Kamelchuk from Ukraine.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, colleagues. Combating climate change in recent years has become a top priority for countries affecting humanity through the speed of greenhouse gas selection and adaptation to climate change over the next 10-15 years, defining the next generation. To prevent catastrophic climate change, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Ukraine became one of the first European countries to ratify it. Other nationally recognized extrajudicial Ukraine to the Paris Agreement is the concept of state development to achieve environmentally and economically feasible transformation in all sectors of the economy: energy, industry, transport, construction, agriculture, and forestry and management waste. At the national level, the document proposes need to exceed 35% of greenhouse gas emissions to 2030 compared to the 1990 levels, or in other words, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 65% in 2030 compared to 1990. We are convinced that the countries that have acceded to the Paris Agreement face similar challenges. The transition to the visa-free economy was related restrictions, the search for balanced method of stimulating production to the fastest possible modeling of equipment, attracting alternative sources of electricity. As a member of Energy Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament and the head of the working group on the disclosure of laws on hydrogen energy, I want to draw your attention to the vision of fuel that is used in our cars and other various power plants in European economies. I fully support the use of electric cars, but if the share of the power generation from window fuels in your country is even higher, then this way you can increase the share of electric cars that support emissions from thermal power plants. Therefore, as soon as possible, introduce the use as a primary fuel for cars, trains and aircraft and fuel for power plants, which can correct the situation. I propose in the future decisions of the Assembly aimed at developing international documents on the responsibility of countries for high efficiency of cars with internal combustion engines running on a selective panel and the height of heat and power generation on equipment using natural gas and coal. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call Mr. Jacques Maire from France. Yeah. He's not here. Well, we'll have to move on. And now I call Miss Felicity Buchan from the United Kingdom.
Oh, she's online.
She's online, yeah. See?
So apologies for the slight technical delay there. Mr. President and esteemed colleagues, it's a great pleasure to talk in this debate. Climate change is one of the most important issues that we face, and clearly it needs to be tackled on a global basis. The UK, as the host of COP26 in a few weeks' time, has a critical role to play in partnership with Italy, who is also a joint host of Glasgow. Glasgow is a great opportunity for us to be ambitious in terms of rebuilding our economies post-coronavirus in a greener, cleaner, and more resilient way. Glasgow is a great opportunity for countries to come together and to set ambitious climate change emissions goals. It is also a great opportunity for wealthier countries to commit funds to help developing nations tackle climate change. I am proud of the commitments that the UK has made. In terms of our emissions, we have committed by 2030 to reduce emissions by 68%. And we have put in place a further timescale of 2035 to reduce emissions by 78%. That is all relative to 1990 levels. These are very ambitious goals, which I am proud of. On climate finance, the UK has committed to doubling its budget for mitigation and adaptation to £11.6 billion over the course of the next 5 years. There's no question in my mind that developing countries will need support as they transition to net zero. And since we're all in this together, it is the responsibility of developed nations to help provide finance and thus to encourage private sector finance. In conclusion, this is such an important debate. It's very important that we do meet climate change goals, but we must also do that while growing our economies. And the UK has been successful in doing that since 1990. What is clear is that the path to net zero must be a joint endeavour.
Thank you. I call Ms. Susana Sumelso from Spain. Seems that she's not here. Yeah. No, unfortunately. So we have to move on. And I call Mr. Konstantinos Evstafiou from Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, human activity has played a fundamental and detrimental role in the deterioration of our planet. Therefore, it is essential that governments, parliaments and stakeholders join efforts towards effective environmental protection policies, as well as awareness campaigns and incentives, so that citizens become informed and actively involved in the fight against environmental deterioration. Accountability must be resumed by all actors, in particular public and private, no matter their legal or corporate status. Strict policies guaranteeing environmental protection have to be adopted. New initiatives need to be translated into package reforms debated within national parliaments, especially when dealing with the emerging autonomous right to a healthy and viable environment. In this context, the role of the Council of Europe in safeguarding human rights should be made more visible. I therefore welcome the proposal to adopt the legal framework and the additional protocols to the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Social Charter. Such valuable instruments will ensure all people's right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment towards ensuring a safe and greener planet for the generations to come. The only concern I have is that the protocol is binding the public authorities, while the protection must be also extended towards private interest and detrimental interventions to the environment. So I would suggest considering in the near future, the adoption of an international or European treaty or convention supplementary to the additional protocol. Once again, I felicitate all the rapporteurs for excellent work and job they have done, and we look forward to implement the nice dispositions of the protocol. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call Ms. Fiona O'Loughlin from Ireland. Thank you.
And this is a very interesting and incredibly important debate. Across the world, we have to acknowledge that scientific evidence is accumulating on the massive detrimental effects of environmental degradation on the health, dignity and well-being of humans and the stability of our ecosystems. And this is a boomerang effect of human economic activities with an excessive and toxic environmental footprint. The next 10 years are absolutely crucial if we are to address the climate and biodiversity crisis, which threatens our safe future on our planet. And we have to acknowledge that the Council of Europe has played a pioneering role in strengthening the protection of human rights in a number of areas. And it's now time to face a major transformative challenge for human rights by securing their enhanced protection in the area of systemic environmental threats to the current and future generations. And this calls absolutely for the explicit recognition of a human right to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment through policies and legal instruments, including legally binding and justifiable ones at Council of Europe level. Tackling climate change is a momentous challenge which requires not only clear political engagement from the authorities, but also the active involvement of citizens. Combining a top-down and a bottom-up approach would enhance citizens' trust in public decision-making, as well as its legitimacy, transparency, inclusiveness and responsiveness, and would also result in greater support for public action. Amongst the forms of participatory democracy which can complement and enrich the work of representative institutions, citizens' assemblies are the best place to harness the collective wisdom and allow citizens to reclaim the public space. Ireland, together with the EU, has long been a champion of transparency, consultation and participation in tackling climate change, and particularly in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, EU, and national climate action. My country has been a vocal advocate for ensuring a balanced representation of countries most affected by climate change and fund a number of initiatives through Irish Aid. At a national level, Ireland's forthcoming Climate Action Plan builds on the government's existing work to collaborate with local authorities, with the public and expert stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you. I call now Mr. Dara Cagliari from Ireland. He's online.
Hello. Good morning, Chairman, and thank you. And it is a pleasure to follow my colleague, Senator O'Loughlin. And I endorse all that she has said, but I also add some words of my own. I welcome Mr. Papandreou's report in relation to citizens' assemblies. And yes, we've had a very successful record of those here in Ireland. They have been instrumental in changing our country. But they cannot be mistaken for detailed engagement with local communities, with local organizations, with sectors that are directly affected by the necessary changes that climate change demands. And we cannot absolve government, or we cannot absolve any organization of the responsibility to bring communities with them along this change. For many communities, the concept of just transition is vital to their survival, to their economic and their social future, to the incomes of families, to the incomes of neighbours and friends. And just transition must be real, must not just be a marketing concept. For many of our citizens across Europe, they have experienced floods and the damage and devastation of floods this summer. We are used to that here in Ireland as an island nation. The difficulties being caused by coastal erosion to communities must also be highlighted and taken on board. And the very difficult decisions that are required by government must be taken in collective and in partnership with people right across the country. We have in Ireland for many, many years a Green Schools programme, which starts at our very youngest schools, our youngest school age. And that has given to our young people a sense of information, a sense of responsibility, and a sense of leadership in leading the climate change debate and in challenging those of us who are older as to changing our own personal responsibilities as well as government policy. Our government here have introduced the Climate Action Bill. We now will soon have our first major climate action budget and all of the necessary steps that will come. We are beginning to make the very difficult changes that are necessary for Ireland to cut our emissions and to change our behaviour. We are a small island nation. We cannot do this on our own. We need the cooperation and the work of every country across the world. This, Chairman, is the human rights challenge of this generation. The Council of Europe has stood for human rights and stood into the breach on so many occasions. It can once again lead that challenge. It can set the challenge to governments and to people around Europe and around the world. But it must bring communities with it. It must be cognizant that we will not make the necessary changes without the support of people right around our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call now Mr. Zoran Tomic from Serbia. He will be online. He will be speaking online.
Thank you, Chairman. Climate change is a problem that we have been facing for decades and that we have been working on to slow down, but we can discuss the results on another occasion. It is certainly necessary to take additional measures to fight the slowdown in climate change and to apply the rule of law in the fight. So we must fight to prevent the average temperature from rising by more than 1.5 degrees and for the Paris Agreement to be respected. So we must influence the members of the Council of Europe to draw up programs. These programs, as stated in the resolution, should help the states and their economy, but also society, to recover from the crown and to continue to achieve the goals set by Paris Agreement as well as the 2030 agenda. So we as parliamentarians can contribute to the whole process by influencing the development of the debate in the society on these topics and by influencing our governments to include a segment of the fight against climate change through national legislation. We as parliamentarians must help strengthen and encourage the fight to preserve the climate and the environment in order to create the conditions for future generations to live and use the resources of this planet. In Serbia, we have taken this path and we have adopted important laws related to climate change, environmental protection, and through our legislation, it has been adopted that no project in Serbia concerning the development and economy will work without an analysis of environmental impact and climate change. So our goal is to have climate neutral projects that will not endanger and affect our planet and the climate. And we are a country that has decided to go in the direction of developing a green economy and protecting the environment. We will give our maximum contribution to protect our planet, no matter how small it may be in relation to large and more developed countries. And regardless to the size of each of our countries, the efforts we all make will affect our planet, and only together we can succeed in that. So that is why I call on everyone to adopt this resolution and recommendations and to make every effort to preserve our planet together. Thank you.
Thank you. I call now Ms. Olena Homenko from Ukraine.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Simon Motkin, Belgium, for the presented report. As a member of the Ukrainian PACE delegation, I would like to stress some of the comments. The already visible consequences of the climate crisis have no doubt that European vision of contemporary human rights protection should become a benchmark for environmental human rights in the 21st century. And therefore, we should step forward to recognize the intrinsic value of nature and ecosystems in the light of the interrelationship between human societies and nature, as mentioned in the clauses 4 and 6 of the draft resolution. We definitely should think about the responsibility that our generation bears towards future generations. The damage to nature and its further effects of the climate crisis will adversely affect our descendants, which must be protected accordingly, as mentioned in clause 12. As mentioned in clause 21 of the explanatory memorandum drafted by Mr. Motkin, Ukraine is indeed listed among the countries which have been addressed in the ECHR pending climate change case. While recognizing the considerable share of the Ukrainian economy in the global greenhouse gas emissions, it should also be noted that in July 2021, our government has set an ambitious goal to meet 35% emission reduction by 2030, compared with 1990 levels. I would also like to remind you of the fact that while other leading world economies, USA, European Union, South Korea, UK, and Japan have pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, the Russian Federation is consistently ignoring climate change and taking zero action to limit its greenhouse gas emissions. To sum up, I totally support the approach of 5P as presented in the draft resolution, referring to preventing and prosecuting violations of the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, protecting the victims, implementing statewide integrated policies that are effective and other of comprehensive response to environmental threats and technological hazards involving parliamentarians. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you. And now I call Mr. Per Lopez from Andorra.
Presidente, quiero en primer lugar felicitar el excelente trabajo que han realizado Simon Buchen, George Papandreou, Cilla Altun-Yandiz y Edith Estela, y manifestar mi firme soporte a sus trabajos. Porque la crisis climática es, sin duda, el mayor reto al que debemos hacer frente. Este no es un problema del futuro, como algunos pretenden. Este es un problema del presente, de ahora mismo. Un reto que requiere de actuaciones políticas decididas y coordinadas. Europa debe liderar este proceso, esta nueva etapa internacional, y revertir los fatales riesgos a los que nos abocan la inacción o las acciones insuficientes en un escenario justo socialmente y con las generaciones futuras. En este formato de debate conjunto de varios trabajos, el punto de unión, en mi opinión, o al menos un punto de unión, en mi opinión, en los diferentes textos que debatimos, es la coincidencia en la ausencia de los mecanismos jurídicos y democráticos necesarios para constituir un derecho humano a un medio ambiente limpio, sano y sostenible. Y a la vez en cómo actualizar otros mecanismos que ya son existentes. El Green New Deal, el Pacte Vert, el Acuerdo Verde son una excelente hoja de ruta, pero creo que son necesarias adaptaciones o nuevas cartas, convenciones, constituciones, leyes y otros mecanismos de participación ciudadana. Por eso creo que debemos aprobar una agenda verde que calendarice con urgencia estas reformas necesarias. Gracias.
Thank you. And now I call Ms. Rosine Garvey from Ireland.
There's never been a more important time for us all as public representatives to be brave, bold and courageous. What we are facing with this climate emergency can only, and I mean only, be mitigated if we politicians can enable all our people to be involved. We need everyone from every level of society to be seen as equal contributors in how we try our very hardest to slow down our rising global temperatures. We need to listen, empower, facilitate and even step aside when necessary, or we haven't a hope. I worked for 14 years on behavioural change with green schools around car use, and I could have talked all day about the benefits of reducing car use. But it was only when I facilitated people in organising events themselves that they saw the merits of leaving the car at home and actually created new habits around their car dependency. People need to know that they matter, what they think matters and what they feel matters. In Ireland, we set up an All-Ireland Citizens' Assembly in October 2017. It was made up of 100 citizens from Irish society, picked at random, with quotas based on gender, age and region. They invited impartial experts on many topics that led to healthy, honest, informative, apolitical debates among the citizens that are important to policy issues facing Irish society. This assembly plays a huge part in enabling Irish society as a whole to access and listen to really informed apolitical experts on very important issues that otherwise could have become polarised and oversimplified by both media and certain political groups. We see this happening more and more these days. Clickbait and sound bites have eroded much of our political democracy, sadly. And now, more than ever, all trust is gone of most politicians by most people. But thanks to our Citizens' Assembly, in no small way, the country of Ireland passed a referendum finally giving women their right to make their own choice for their own bodies. It finally gave all people in Ireland the right to choose marriage if they so wish, irrespective of gender. And most recently, the Citizens' Assembly fed into the Climate Act, passed just a few months ago, that has the most ambitious targets in the world, with its mission to reduce carbon emissions by 51% in just 9 years. As South Sudan makes the long journey from winning independence 10 years ago, after a long, brutal war, a people-driven constitution is being worked on. In San Marino, we see citizen-led and citizen-owned photovoltaic solar power supplying up to 24% of the country's power, thanks to in no small way to one of our colleagues here, Gerardo Giovagnoli. And so I say to all of you today that are public representatives, it is our duty to engage and empower as much citizen engagement as possible. We now need to decide on actions, and the actions have to be for the people, by the people.
Thank you very much. And now I call Ms. Minerva Hernandez Ramos from Mexico. She'll be speaking online.
La pandemia relacionada con el COVID nos ha hecho reflexionar sobre el impacto que tiene la actividad humana en el cambio climático. en las enfermedades zoonóticas y en la urgente necesidad de cambiar nuestro comportamiento, patrones de consumo y modelos de producción hacia objetivos más favorables al medio ambiente. Las naciones del mundo se han esforzado en que la protección al ambiente sea un mandato del poder público, que ese mandato de la voluntad popular se materialice en leyes, en instituciones gubernamentales y en políticas públicas, pero a la fecha no ha sido suficiente. Los límites propios de la democracia representativa muestran una solución insuficiente frente a un problema de dimensiones planetarias como lo es el cambio climático. Las acciones de Greta Thunberg nos han mostrado el error de considerar que solo deben provenir de liderazgos políticos o de instituciones gubernamentales, cuando existen millones de personas que no solamente están interesadas en mitigar los efectos adversos del cambio climático, sino que además cada uno está poniendo su empeño en modificar su conducta para hacerla amigable con el medio ambiente y que incluso se han organizado para coordinar esfuerzos e incidir en el curso de las acciones gubernamentales. Ante la proliferación de noticias falsas, ante la reciente desconfianza en evidencia científica y ante el constante desencanto que muchos ciudadanos en el mundo han mostrado sobre los procesos de democracia representativa, lo que ha derivado en el surgimiento de regímenes que se ostentan como democráticos, pero que en realidad atentan contra las libertades civiles y los derechos fundamentales, necesitamos impulsar mayor educación y conocimiento sobre el cambio climático en los ciudadanos. Debemos promover el compromiso de los ciudadanos con las acciones en beneficio del medio ambiente. Tenemos que encauzar ese interés colectivo que tiene la población en la protección al ambiente y en la búsqueda de revertir los impactos climáticos en soluciones de mediano y largo plazo para el beneficio del planeta. Y como bien ha sido señalado en esta asamblea, se requiere fortalecer los mecanismos posibles de democracia participativa necesarios para involucrar a los ciudadanos, en especial a los más jóvenes, en los procesos de toma de decisiones y de diseño de políticas públicas. La ruta que esta asamblea recomienda para el Comité de Ministros del Consejo de Europa es un gran paso en la dirección correcta y representa una guía útil para que en el continente americano vayamos también construyendo, desde lo más local y en los aspectos más cercanos al ciudadano, mecanismos de democracia participativa para la protección del ambiente y la mitigación del cambio climático. Muchas gracias, un abrazo desde México.
Muchas gracias. Now I call Ms. Inka Hopsu from Finland.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, the environment and human rights are strongly linked. When we protect nature, tackle climate change and halt the loss of biodiversity, we are equally protecting and promoting human rights around the world. The consequences of climate change, like extreme weather events, threaten fundamental human rights such as right to health or right to an adequate standard of living. Individuals who have to leave their homes due to droughts or floods are exposed to many human rights violations. The consequences of biodiversity loss or climate change will further increase inequality, since the impact of these phenomena will hit first the poorest people and those who are already among the most vulnerable groups of people, such as persons with disabilities, indigenous people, and women and girls. Some geographical areas, such as small island states and the people who live in them, are particularly in danger. The Arctic is also a geographically challenging area where the effects of climate change are dramatically visible. In my home country, Finland, especially in the north, the indigenous Sami people have observed changes in seasons, temperatures, vegetation, fauna, reindeer behavior, etc. All these threaten their right to maintain and develop their own culture and traditional livelihoods. Thank you for the rapporteurs in highlighting the necessity for everyone to have access to justice when the rights to a safe, clean and healthy and sustainable environment are offended. Individuals and also groups must have ways to demand accountability from governments. Therefore, it would be worth considering whether there should be also a possibility for collective complaints included in the European Convention of Human Rights to strengthen environmental protection in the future in the light of international debate on ecocide. Mr. President, to effectively address the magnitude of climate change and biodiversity loss, we need to tackle the temporal dimension of politics. Policy making is very often short-sighted. Short-sighted policies are not optimal in the fight against long-term phenomena. We need to take better account of future generations in decision-making at every level. We need more possibilities for everybody's involvement. Thank you.
Thank you. I call now Mr. Gagan Mahindra from the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow delegates, I am honoured to be speaking in this critical debate. Climate change represents a very real threat to the environment and subsequently all of us here. It is the responsibility of all parties, from the individual to multinational institutions such as the Council of Europe, to lobby for continued action against global warming. As a Member of Parliament in the United Kingdom, I have witnessed the damage and devastation that the climate can have on my own constituents. Since my time in Parliament, areas like Moore Park, Bovingdon and Long Marston in my constituency have witnessed flooding never seen before, damaging homes, schools and businesses. The UK accounts for approximately 1.2% of global emissions. Despite this small figure, I am pleased to see that the UK government has taken the initiative to strive for net zero by 2050. Further to this, the UK's 10-point plan lays the blueprint for how we will achieve net zero, which includes mobilising £12 billion of government investment. We expect to meet with other states in November of this year at the COP26 summit, and I hope the conference will encourage all of us to cooperate and tackle climate change. But we as a community can do more. Members of the Council of Europe should encourage states to adopt environmentally friendly policies and inspire private industries to consider sustainable business practices. Earlier this month, the UK lobbied some of the richest countries to collectively donate $100 billion annually to help developing countries combat climate change. This highlights the UK's belief that everyone has the right to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. As suggested by my fellow delegates and in the aforementioned reports, laws may be necessary, but I believe that the focus of this Council should be on encouragement rather than punishment when discussing the strengthening of corporate environmental responsibility. It is conferences like this that allow us all to promote the global battle against climate change, and I thank everyone here for participating in this important debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I call Mr. Irakli Chikovani from Georgia. He's not here. Yeah, unfortunately, he's not with us. And in this case, I call Ms. Lesia Vasilenko. Yeah, Lesia Vasilenko from Ukraine.
Thank you, President, and thank you, dear rapporteurs and dear colleagues, for all the powerful statements we have been hearing this morning in this room. I am so happy that this House has an almost unanimous understanding of the urgency of the issue at hand. We truly must act now in order to continue to enjoy our basic human rights, the right to life and the right to health, in order to live in a comfortable and secure environment, and in order to leave our children a safe and sound planet. Very basic things, one might think, and yet. And yet, for at least 2 decades, we observe in this Assembly the reluctance to complement the Convention text with clear-cut definitions of environmental human rights. When the environmental rights issue was last raised here at the PACE, the arguments against an additional environmental human rights protocol have watered down the issue to merely a guidebook on human rights and the environment. I sincerely hope that today, almost 10 years on, we will find the political will and necessary number of votes to support the development of such an additional protocol and finally stop the European human rights system from lagging behind similar systems on the American and African continent. That is right. The African Charter of Human Rights has long enshrined the right to a general satisfactory environment in its Article 24. The American Convention on Human Rights has, of course, the San Salvador Protocol, where Article 11 stipulates the right to a healthy environment. So this European Environmental Protocol can be a powerful deterrent and a prevention mechanism for further environmental threats emerging from the territory of respective member states. Putting environmental rights in writing will have a definite impact on the activities in the corporate and industrial sectors, and finally will have a positive impact on curbing the overconsumption culture, which is also present here in Europe. Please notice, colleagues, that the only risks and reservations to a strong recognition of the environmental right are made today by representatives of countries that espouse policies which are counter-environmental and which endorse large fossil fuel projects. When our colleague from the Russian Federation spoke earlier today about Crimea and the lack of water and energy resources there, he basically gave an account of what Russia's occupying forces have done to the lawfully Ukrainian territory of Crimea. As we all recall, in our numerous resolutions, Russia has annexed Crimea in 2014, and since then has exercised effective control in the territory of Crimea. This basically means that Russia, and Russia alone, bears all responsibility for the territory it has occupied, and so ruthlessly degraded with its anti-environmentalist policies and total lack of environmental management. Thus, I hope that with the adoption of this binding environmental protocol, countries in breach will be made liable and be led to changing their policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vasilenko. And I now give the floor to Mrs. Petri Honkonen, Finland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, regarding the practical implementation of climate policy, the active involvement of citizens is an essential element which we should never disregard. As Mr. Papandreou reminds us in his excellent report, the fundamental premise here is to use people's own language. The language we use must always be clear and explicit when we are talking about climate impacts and actions needed. We should keep in mind that there is a huge risk if solutions are made only on the terms of highly educated middle class and the upper middle class people. In that case, many aspects of a disadvantaged social position will be offside. In the current public debate on climate change, entire professional groups and livelihoods are being blamed and even stigmatized. In Finland, for example, those who work in agriculture have found themselves in a difficult position in these discussions. Unfortunately, this will only increase confrontation in society and weaken support for climate action. Participatory democracy is needed, but I want to highlight that eventually the positive public opinion is essential to get enough support to the climate policy. In the long run, climate change creates poverty and inequality. Climate action in practice may also undermine the livelihoods and social status of certain groups of people if their perspective is not taken into account. To succeed in tackling these severe consequences, it is our responsibility to make a climate policy that does not increase the dichotomy, but is creative and inclusive, and in addition, effective in terms of business. As I pointed out in the beginning, the essential thing here is to speak clearly and understandably on the climate change and especially on climate action, so we could all proceed in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Honkonen. And now give the floor to Mr. Lukas Savikas from Lithuania. Yeah.
Thank you, dear Chair, dear colleagues. Earlier, the impact of global warming was perceived as populist, unreal rhetoric. But today, we can clearly state that the effects of it are very much real and very much here. I completely agree with the statements heard today, that if we need to achieve real results, we need to attract more people to the problem. Not only politicians, but also people from different age groups, ethnic groups, different genders, and different regions. We need to ask people to hear their voices in contemporary problems, such as global warming. We all need to participate in this process. The model of People's Assembly is a powerful tool that has been proven to be successful time after time. Ireland, France, Britain, and others. It helps not only with attracting people to the problem, but also increases the public's knowledge in a subject that the Assembly is needed to face. The model of Assembly also increases the culture of democracy and the trust of the people. One more thing that I want to touch as well is rising the legal liability in the context of climate change. We have to take a stand and take all the needed legal actions which would help fight the effect of damaging the environment. But we cannot forget to be united and to strengthen our cooperation while achieving the necessary decisions. Therefore, I am looking forward to the adoption of resolutions presented today in a plenary, and especially that our solidarity and common positions is clearly needed today to revive the needed efforts to prevent the climate catastrophe. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Safikas. And I would like to give the floor now to the Observer of Israel, Mrs. Emily Mowati. Is she there? Can we contact her? She's not online. So the next one is also online. There's Mrs. Carina Olsen from Sweden. Is she online? Yeah, you are there.
Yes. Thank you very much, President, dear colleagues. A wise management of Earth resources is a prerequisite for the future of mankind. And of course, I think about that in my different roles, as politician, as woman, as citizen, but even more as grandmother for my grandchildren. The science is very clear, and there is no room for doubt. Together, we must do everything we can to stop a climate catastrophe. In Sweden, major investments are now being made, not at least in industry. For example, to produce steel without coal, and in the transport sector to reduce emissions. But climate work must include all relevant areas, and the climate no national borders. We have a historic opportunity to implement measures that both reduce emissions and provide new jobs. We must continue to push for green transition, put pressure on the major emitting countries to live up to the Paris Agreement, and assist countries that need help in reducing their emissions. The climate challenge has a clear relationship to equality and gender equality. And therefore, I'm so glad to hear this report and the rapporteurs. The change is thus not only our clearest solidarity, what we can do for future generations. It is solidarity with each other, a community building that we only can do together. Climate change is the fateful issue of our time. Thank you, and let's do it together.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Olsen. And now I would like to give the floor to Madame Monica Bonnel, Andorra. Vous avez la parole.
Merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente, chers collègues. Le changement climatique est de la plus grande importance et a besoin de beaucoup d'actions rapides et décisives. C'est pour cela que la participation de tous les acteurs économiques et sociaux est extrêmement importante. Mon pays, l'Andorre, en est un clair exemple. En 2018, le Parlement d'Andorre a voté à l'unanimité une loi promouvant la transition énergétique et le changement climatique. En 2020, avec la participation active des associations environnementales, Les jeunes ainsi que de divers acteurs sociaux et économiques se sont tous unis pour déclarer un état d'urgence climatique et écologique, devenant l'un des 10 premiers pays au monde à valider et à soumettre les textes à l'OTAN. C'était grâce à tout ce travail et à la législation en vigueur qu'aujourd'hui l'Andorre a une stratégie énergétique nationale de lutte contre le changement climatique avec un objectif essentiel: atteindre la neutralité de carbone d'ici à l'année 2050 et un fonds vert inclus dans le projet de loi du budget général qui se nourrit de taxes finalistes et sert à financer les actions prévues pour la décarbonisation vers l'objectif de la neutralité de carbone. Actuellement, nous sommes en train de travailler sur une loi d'économie circulaire élaborée avec la participation des citoyens et des acteurs économiques. Nous continuons également à maintenir une communication fluide avec ces acteurs afin de continuer à légiférer en faveur d'une plus grande participation des citoyens à la résolution d'un problème aussi important comme le changement climatique. Toutes les institutions jouent un rôle essentiel et cette Assemblée parlementaire n'est pas une exception. C'est pour cela que je vous félicite pour le rapport présenté et j'encourage à tous à poursuivre la lutte contre le changement climatique. Je vais certainement voter en faveur de vos rapports. Merci pour votre attention. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Bonnel. And I will give the floor now to Mrs. Yulia Ovchinnikova from Ukraine. You have the floor.
Dear Madam Chair, dear Mr. Rapporteur, dear assemblies, I would like to note how much I, as representative of environmental community, feel the Assembly support by seeing that the environmental agenda is put forward. Climate change will impact our lives, economies, democratic political systems, stability and peace worldwide. All key world organizations and expert institutions have been calling to start taking urgent actions in different areas. The relation between human rights and environment is self-evident. The United Nations and European Union continue to raise issues of climate and environmental protection by the adopting of important climate and environmental documents, such as United Nations Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement and the European Climate Law, which sets a goal to reduce clean greenhouse gas emissions, investing in green technologies and protecting the environment. Environmental pollution, loss of the biodiversity and the climate crisis are making the people and the planet sick, leading the premature deaths and the current generation and still unable living space between us. So I think that despite the human rights and carefree, healthy and environment imposed to the threat to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment for the future generation by neglecting the environmental protection. I want to add that we haven't really legal binding instruments in order to save the territory we restart war and the occupied territories. It's also about environmental and human rights. I would like to emphasize the importance of amending the European Convention of Human Rights and its protocol to the European Social Charter in terms of establishing a clear responsibility of member states to keep the environment in good condition, ensuring and dignified life to a good health and the full implementation of other fundamental rights. The protection of human rights and the environmental must be the symbiosis with the environmental education for young people, for young researchers. And the Assembly also calls to the Member States, to Council of Europe, to fulfill all their obligations arising from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the Paris Agreement. So, members of the Council of Europe have always taken charge of the climate agenda and pay a lot of our attention for issues of climate and its change in our world. This topic is urgent, not just for us, people sitting in this conference hall, but for every organism on the Earth's surface. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mrs. Ovchinnikova. And now I give the floor to the last speaker in this debate. That is Mr. Zeki Hakan Sidali from Turkey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to congratulate all four reporters, Mr. Mokin, Mr. Papandreou, Mr. Altınyaldız, and Madam Estrela for their visionary and comprehensive work. Humanity has solved problems throughout history with developed mechanisms, inventions, and collaborations. We survived many severe natural difficulties by inventing mechanical tools against physical distances, promoting peace against conflicts, developing liberal democracy against tyranny, and nowadays finding a vaccine against COVID-19. What we call civilization is the result of that common struggle, common accumulation, and common heritage of mankind based on cooperation, technological development, and reason and science. Humanity, our civilization, is today facing the self-caused climate crisis, the biggest challenge ever. This very complex and threatening problem could deeply concuss liberal democracies and even destroy our future. To overcome that, we should develop much more cooperation globally, all together with all stakeholders nationally, and carry on responsibility of the struggles locally. As a result, all of us, regardless of whether we are rich or poor, rural or urban, Western or Eastern, believer or not, must fight for our children's destiny. Today at this debate, I hope we will be able to get steps closer to this non-delayable cause because we don't have much time left. We must fully support the idea of transforming the right to the environment as one of the most fundamental human rights globally, as pointed out Mr. Mokin. I invite governments and companies to take responsibility as they have seen our nature as their backyard and polluted the environment without calculating any social and environmental outcome. In order to accomplish this, everyone must take responsibility, the youth, NGOs, even the citizens without any cool title. I underline the need for participatory democratic structures in building a common mind in this challenge, as Mr. Papandreou pointed out. Within liberal democracies, citizens, mainly youth at the center, should lead to implement new regulations immediately. For these regulations, we need global legal framework against the environmental damages caused as underlined by Mr. Altınyaldız. This should be a determination we all should agree. We said we will not leave anyone behind. In order to succeed, we should not leave any of the above-mentioned aspects behind too, as they are valuable if they are simultaneously applied. There is much to say, but as my time is up, so is the world, at least for the humankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sidali. So we had now all the speakers, and we come now to the replies. First, I would like to call Mr. Moutquin. He's the rapporteur for the first report to reply. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Alors, ça va être un exercice assez compliqué, tant vos interventions étaient complètes et, je dois le dire, très chaleureuses, malgré quelques nuances qu'il y a pu avoir sur certains de nos rapports, qui sont, il faut le dire, assez rares. Je suis ravi de voir qu'en vous écoutant, la prise de conscience de l'enjeu des règlements climatiques, elle est totale. Il y a 10 ans, dans des assemblées comme celle-ci, il pouvait encore avoir des doutes chez certains parlementaires. Aujourd'hui, on voit dans vos actions, dans vos inquiétudes, que cette prise de conscience est totale. Et pour ça, vraiment, sincèrement, je vous en remercie. Monsieur Ries, vous expliquez que vous avez des doutes par rapport à certains aspects de la convention, du rapport. Je voudrais rappeler que ce rapport est un panel de propositions. Il faut vraiment le voir comme une encyclopédie, comme un signal qu'on envoie au comité des ministres et à d'autres d'ailleurs. Il ne faut pas sous-estimer le travail de notre Assemblée. Et je pense que c'est important de le rappeler. Madame Tanguy a parlé d'une expression que j'ai beaucoup aimée. Elle parlait de champ des possibles. Et je pense que notre champ des possibles dans cette Assemblée par rapport au droit à l'environnement, il est très très important. D'ailleurs, Madame, excusez-moi si j'écorche les noms, Madame Karamanili a parlé entre autres d'écocide, de biens communs, et je pense que c'est vraiment des questions sur lesquelles notre Assemblée pourrait se saisir. Madame Arpaderi d'Azerbaïdjan, vous avez tout à fait raison de vous inquiéter de la question des plus précaires dans cette question des réchauffements climatiques. Je pense que la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique ne va pas impacter négativement les plus précaires, elle ne doit pas les impacter, au contraire, on doit la faire en se rappelant que le dérèglement climatique, c'est les personnes précarisées qui sont touchées de manière les plus importante, notamment en termes de pollution, mais aussi beaucoup d'autres choses. Monsieur Bashkin, donc si vous lisez bien ce rapport, le rapport n'est pas uniquement autour de droits contraignants, il y a d'autres propositions. Je pense à la Convention 5P, et d'ailleurs, vous expliquez une réticence par rapport à la question des nouvelles technologies, qui apparaît de manière assez succincte dans mon rapport, et je pense que la question des nouvelles technologies et la question du droit à l'environnement sain est complètement liée. Monsieur Ducrène a exposé la question des voitures électriques, par exemple. Est-ce que des voitures électriques sont une invention écologique? Est-ce que la 5G, qui va nécessiter une quantité d'émissions de CO2 gigantesque, qui peut aussi être utile dans la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique, voilà, il y a toute une balance à faire. Et pour ça, dans le rapport, c'est vraiment la Convention 5P qui est un outil très intéressant puisqu'elle est basée sur la prévention, la précaution. Voilà pour les interventions. Beaucoup de personnes ont rappelé le Covid. Je pense que le Covid a montré en effet que le dérèglement climatique est une urgence, puisqu'on sait que nos rapports à l'animal et notamment la déforestation va augmenter ce nombre de maladies. Je voudrais rapidement remercier sincèrement mes collègues rapporteurs. Vous voyez qu'on est des collègues de pays différents, de générations différentes, et ça montre très bien que c'est un enjeu qui est beaucoup plus global que celui de la jeune génération. Remercier très chaleureusement les services. C'est la première fois que j'avais fait un rapport dans la commission, et on a vraiment des services d'un professionnalisme et d'une qualité incroyable. Et puis vous dire que voilà, l'heure est venue à l'action plus que jamais, et vous remercier sincèrement. Merci.
Thank you very much. Normally we would ask Mr. Leite Ramos, but we will do that afterwards because in this committee we have two reports. So I would like to call now Mr. Papandreou. He's rapporteur for the second report. You have 3 minutes.
Dear colleagues, I watched with my compatriots with uttermost horror the devastating fires in my country this summer that destroyed not only our habitats, but also some of the most beautiful and ancient forests in Greece. In a tragic symbolism, an ancient olive tree of 2,500 years old survived, and being mentioned in ancient texts went up in flames. So our human rights and our civilization will also go up in flames if we do not respect the rights of other species, the rights of our natural habitat. And this does need, as has been proposed, a common corpus, legal corpus, as the Council of Europe should promote. And this falls, of course, to the governments and to the parliaments, to their responsibility. But the transition, this major transition, cannot be effected unless we have our citizens involved, unless they own this process. And that is why we are talking about social justice and climate justice. It cannot fall on the disadvantaged. We cannot have an environmental apartheid. Secondly, we need an educated citizenship. And of course, we need a participatory society. I say this because there were some comments, and I thank the colleagues for these important comments, many of them supporting the idea of more participation. But there were also some questions about this. I want to answer to Mr. Howell, for example. This is not a process to replace our parliaments. It is a complementary process to support the democratic processes. Secondly, we generally consult experts as politicians. Why not consult an organized body of citizens, not only every 4 years, but consistently through these citizens' assemblies? And of course, it is not only citizens' assemblies. There are other methods of participatory democracy, using the digital platforms to allow for an agora, an electronic agora, where people can consistently voice their views, all citizens. I did this when I was in government. We created what we called wiki laws. So before the laws went to Parliament, the the ministers would have to publish their law so that we get comments, and then it comes back to the cabinet to be adopted, the good recommendations, and then sent to Parliament for discussion and legislation. I also believe that the wisdom of the collective is very important. We see that working with citizens, they can come up with solutions which we may not think of. We also can go beyond, as others said, Mrs. Garvey said this, go beyond partisanship. I would add to this also, we have a lot of money, as Jeffrey Sachs yesterday said, money in politics. When we randomly choose citizens, they are much less able to be targeted by powerful lobbies. And this can help our policies. Also in social media, we have the digital giants with their algorithms that create hate speech and so on. These types of participatory practices can allow us for a more organized, peaceful, and useful debate. And finally, this will create a national debate and educate our societies, but it also can be a cross-border debate, which is very important for Europe, for the European Union, of course, for the Council of Europe. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Papandreou. Now I would like to ask Mr. Nemeth, Chair of the Political Affairs Committee, if he wants to use his 3 minutes which he has as Chair of the committee. And he does.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Nemeth.
The report received the unanimous support of the committee. Mr. Chairperson, dear colleagues, in our view, the report charters a way forward on how to innovate and modernize democracy to make it more efficient, but also more inclusive, accountable, and more responsive to the needs and views of citizens. It explains how participatory and deliberative democracy can be complementary to the representative form of democracy. We don't see any conflict between the two, and even strengthen the functioning of democratic institutions, allowing for greater civil participation and engagement. Combating climate change and protecting the environment are fields in which these new forms of democracy have been successfully used in instances, but we should continue our reflection even further, because all those people in the debate were right who suggested that they can be useful and usefully applied also in other areas of concern and the political life. Dear colleagues, I invite you to vote in favor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nemeth. And I call now Mr. Al-Jumyaldis, Rapporteur for the third report, to reply. And you also have 3 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Chair and dear colleagues. I'd like to thank all our esteemed parliamentarians for their valuable contributions and support on our reports. I may not mention many of the friends and colleagues who supported our reports, but I like to mention some of the friends that mark something that I picked. Ms. Arpadia said there should be an accessible technology for transforming green economy. Yes, I fully agree with that. And Ms. Yashar rightly mentioned legal aspects of climate has not been harmonized internationally yet. Of course, the one that has not been included in domestic law as well. And Mr. Sigmund from Hungary asked, who will pay the price of climate change? I propose in my report that the polluter pays the price. And Ms. Petra said and proposed a general rapporteur on climate change. I also support this idea. And Ms. Sayek and Mr. Sidali rightly mentioned that, yes, there should be a legal framework harmonized internationally. And dear Chair and colleagues, the green recovery requires governments to act decisively together, as I mentioned in my previous speech presentation. The European Commission could be a leading force behind it in collaboration with international organizations such as UN, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the OECD. On the way forward, in addition to economic actions, strong legal measures are required. Strengthened global cooperation is needed to reach targets. Legal and economic actions should go hand in hand. And also, I would like to underline, as many consequences of climate change are irreversible, at least in the short term, it is important that the revision of or replacement of these two Council of Europe conventions, numbers 172 and 150, should be given the highest priority on the Council of Europe agenda. And lastly, I just would like to thank my chairperson on the Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights and the Secretariat for their valuable support and contribution to the work and to myself always. And I thank you all for your contribution and support. I'm sure the future will be different by this comprehensive and conducive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tounialdis. And now give the floor to Mr. Silevic, if he wants, the chair of the committee.
Thank you, Madam President. Any political program or project or concept needs legal framework to be implemented. And these ideas which were expressed by our today's rapporteurs and participants in this debate anyway must be put into the form of some legislation, both international provisions and national legislation, in order to be implemented. This is what we are interested in, and this is what we must do as politicians. It's very easy to speak for a long time, very loudly, very beautifully, but without clear legal regulation, nothing will change. So this is why I believe that the contribution of the Legal Affairs Committee into this debate is so important. And our rapporteur, Mr. Altounialdis, highlighted clearly two serious areas where we should work. First, international cooperation at the level of the Council of Europe. Yes, we do have two good conventions which simply do not work. The states do not ratify them and they are not applied in practice. What should be done to make these conventions work? And the report contains a number of interesting and potentially effective proposals. And the second aspect is national legislation, national judiciary, and implementation at the level of member states, which is also very important. And here we can use some input from national court, because the case law is growing and this is really important. I would like to express my gratitude to our rapporteur, Mr. Altounialdis, for his very diligent work, and to our secretariat for all assistance. And the last thing I would like to say, I was a bit surprised when I saw the results of the latest sociological polls about the priorities for people in Latvia and also in Europe. It appears that for youth, for younger people, the climate, environment, and healthy environment is a top problem to be resolved. More than 60% believe that this is a top priority. And this is a problem of us, but of course of our children and grandchildren. And what is at stake now? what kind of Europe and planet we will leave to our children and grandchildren. Yes, it's very cumbersome, it's very difficult, it costs a lot of money, but still it's about the future of our children. So I believe that we must tackle this issue very seriously, and today's debate, I hope, will contribute to the achievement of this goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Silevic. And I call now for the last report our colleague, Mrs. Edith Estrela.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Tout d'abord, je veux remercier les intervenants pour leur soutien et leurs commentaires sur mon rapport. Et des remerciements particuliers sont dus à Boris Klevich pour son soutien au nom de la Commission des affaires juridiques, qui a déposé quelques amendements que j'ai soutenus et qui ont contribué à clarifier les conseils. Merci beaucoup, Boris. Madame Yasko de l'Ukraine a parlé des droits humains qui sont liés aux droits environnementaux. Ce sujet, ce thème, c'est traité dans mon rapport de la Commission pour l'égalité de genre cet après-midi, que je vais présenter cet après-midi. Le rapport s'appelle « Lutte contre les inégalités en matière de droit à un environnement sûr, sain et propre ». Je remercie aussi le soutien et les propositions ambitieuses de Mme Mariette Karamanli et aussi les propositions de Mme Petre Bayer. Je soutiens la proposition d'avoir au sein du Conseil de l'Europe un rapporteur général pour les questions du climat. C'est une bonne idée. Chers collègues, malgré quelques divergences d'opinion, en substance, nous sommes toutes et tous d'accord. Le changement climatique est une réalité, n'est pas une fiction. Le diagnostic est connu, donc c'est le temps d'agir vite. Si nous voulons avoir une planète pour vivre, nous devons agir rapidement. Et nous n'avons plus de temps pour les hésitations. La responsabilité est de toutes et de tous, de chacun et de chacune. Il est nécessaire de changer le paradigme de développement économique, mais aussi les comportements individuels. Des petits gestes peuvent faire la différence. Économiser de l'eau, économiser de l'énergie, etc. Pour conclure, je tiens à souligner l'importance du réseau parlementaire que je propose dans mon rapport et que j'espère va mériter le soutien de notre Assemblée. Je remercie de nouveau les remarques des collègues et je veux également remercier le président de la Commission des affaires sociales et le secrétariat qui m'a beaucoup aidé. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Madame Estrela. And now Mr. Leite Ramos has the honor to speak 2 times, 3 minutes, because as chair of the Social Affairs Committee, you have 2 reports. I give you the floor.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues. Tout d'abord, je voudrais féliciter et remercier les 4 rapporteurs par son excellent travail, par ses réflexions et ses propositions, mais notamment en particulier féliciter M. Simon Moutkan et Mme Edith Estrela par le travail qu'ils ont développé au sein de la Commission et dont les résultats sont ici, comme ils ont référé. C'est vraiment un travail que, malgré quelques petites divergences, il y a un consensus sur la substance de ces propositions. Deuxièmement, pour vous dire qu'il y a un mot qui pèse sur nous depuis longtemps, mais que dans ces 4 rapports, il est bien présent. le mot est urgence. Si vraiment on veut faire quelque chose, il faut passer aux actes tout de suite. Il nous reste un peu plus de 8 ans pour changer nos modes de vie, d'après le panel des experts scientifiques. La jeunesse de nos pays ne nous pardonnerait pas de ne pas l'avoir entendu. Et il faut rappeler que les jeunes étaient plus de 600 000 à faire la grève du climat la semaine dernière en Allemagne. Les prochaines échéances électorales seront les élections du siècle dans chacun de nos pays. Au-delà du vote, c'est un changement profond de nos sociétés qui est attendu. Pour limiter la dégradation de l'environnement et le dérèglement du climat, il faudrait des actions fortes, rapides et durables. Nous savons depuis longtemps que notre maison brûle. Comme il écrit M. Moutkan, nous aurons besoin de nouveaux instruments pour mettre notre cadre législatif à la hauteur de la situation. Il faudrait à la fois enrichir la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme et la Charte sociale européenne. Nous devons y inscrire le droit à un environnement sûr, propre, sain et durable. Notre continent est à la traîne des autres régions du monde sur ce sujet. Mon collègue propose aussi de préparer une convention 5P sur les menaces pour l'environnement et les risques technologiques pour la santé, la dignité et la vie humaine, et d'investir le champ de la responsabilité environnementale des entreprises. Notre droit doit protéger l'environnement. Sur ces sujets juridiques, le Conseil de l'Europe est attendu en tant que vigie des droits humains, de la démocratie et de la règle de droit en Europe. Tous les efforts compteront. Chaque pas dans le bon sens sera apprécié. Les conventions relatives à la conservation de la vie sauvage et sur le paysage sont déjà 2 exemples de bonnes pratiques. Soyons à la hauteur des enjeux. Faisons œuvre de créativité s'il faut. Nous devons regarder ce qui est fait ailleurs, explorons toutes les solutions qui nous sont présentées pour trouver la résilience climatique qui nous manque. Notre Assemblée est aussi un formidable espace démocratique où des parlementaires de 47 États échangent. J'espère que la proposition de Mme Estrela de lancer un réseau de parlementaires sera soutenue. Sa mission sera d'inspirer et de suivre les actions des autorités nationales face à la dégradation de l'environnement et au dérèglement climatique, mais aussi d'assurer l'enrichissement mutuel des idées, tout en assurant l'échange entre parlementaires. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you very much. You was the last speaker in this debate of this morning. I declare the debate now closed and we go on with the vote.
Dear colleagues, we now come to the votings. Thanks, Ria, very esteemed Vice President and all the other Vice President colleagues to help us out in a very busy day. So, the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a draft resolution and draft recommendation document 15367, to which no amendments have been tabled. Draft resolution. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15367. A simple majority is required. Members present in the chambers should use the hemicycle voting system, and members participating remotely should vote using the remote voting system. The vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now open. So,
wait.
Vote is closed. Results, please. Congratulations. We will now consider the draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. We will not, a two-thirds majority, since it's a recommendation, is required. The vote is open.
Okay, you can close the vote.
Vote is closed. Results, please.
Wow.
I see that we have a two-thirds majority. Congratulations.
Unanimous. It's unanimous.
As you see, we have 19 abstentions. Therefore, the recommendation is adopted unanimously. That is really a great moment. We now come to just a second. The Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy has presented a draft resolution and a draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15351. A simple majority is required. The vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now open. Vote is closed. The resolution is carried. Congratulations. We will now consider the draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. A two-thirds majority is required. The vote is open. Vote is closed. Again, carried unanimously. Congratulations. We will now consider the draft. This was the recommendation. I'm a bit puzzled here.
No, it's the legal.
Just give me a second, because...
Page 9.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm just a little bit surprised that we really get this unanimity, so I'm a bit out of balance. It doesn't happen a lot, I have to say, but I'm really a little bit shaken. Okay, addressing issues of criminal and civil liability in the context of climate change. Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution and a draft recommendation in document 15362. No amendments have been tabled. A simple majority is required for the draft resolution. The vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now open. Vote is closed. The resolution is carried. We will now consider the draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. A two-thirds majority is required. The vote is open. Vote is closed.
Unanimous.
Results, please. And once again carried unanimously. Thank you. The Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a draft resolution to which 6 amendments have been tabled and a draft recommendation to which 1 amendment has been tabled. This is document 15353. First, we will consider the 6 amendments to the draft resolution. Unanimous approval of amendments. I understand that the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 7 to the draft resolution, which were unanimously approved by the Committee, should be declared as agreed by the Assembly. Is that so, Mr. Leite Ramos? Can you please say that in the mic?
Président, c'est comme ça.
Merci. If there is no objection, then I declare the amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 7 to the draft resolution to be agreed. Then I have to go to page 19, it's been told here. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution as amended by the 6 amendments contained in document 1535 as modified. A simple majority is required. Members present in the chamber should use, as I told you, the hemicycle voting system, others the remote voting system. The vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now open. The vote is closed. The resolution is carried, unanimously, by the way. Now we come to the consideration of amendments on the draft recommendation. The Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a recommendation to which 1 amendment has been tabled. I understand that the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 6 to the draft recommendation, which was unanimously approved by the Committee, should be declared as agreed by the Assembly. Is that so, Mr. Leite Ramos?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Does anyone object? Since there's no objection, I declare that Amendment 6 to the draft recommendation has been agreed. Then, well, it is supported. So we now will proceed to vote on the draft recommendation as amended, contained in document 1535. A 2/3 majority is required. The vote is open.
Yes.
Vote is closed. Unanimously carried. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank all of you. I mean, this is a great result, unanimous adoption of recommendation, which means that we will table these recommendations to the Committee of Ministers. And may I announce that, hoping this would happen, I prepared something for all of you to carry on, which is a hashtag campaign. So in the light box, the media box, you will, all of you who wishes to make use of it, these are the 2 hashtags that we prepared. In English, environment right now, et en français, environnement un droit. Congratulations to all of you. Thank you very much for the enormous support, and I think this is a historic day for the Council of Europe. The Assembly will hold its next public sitting this afternoon at 3 p.m. This is the event. I hope to see you there, and extreme Congratulations to the rapporteurs and to all of you. Thank you very much.